66 million years ago, in the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, a visitor from the void changed the trajectory of life on Earth forever. A rock, more than 10 kilometers wide, travelling faster than a bullet, pierced the sky and met the planet with a force so immense it dwarfed the combined arsenal of every weapon humanity would one day create. In an instant, oceans boiled at their edges, forests ignited, mountains shuddered, and a continent was scarred. This was the Chicxulub impact, the event that ended the reign of the dinosaurs and redefined the meaning of survival. But if the story of extinction is violent, the story of recovery is stranger, slower, and even more profound. After the fires, after the endless night, after the collapse of ecosystems, life did not vanish. It began to reorganize, to stitch itself back together in patterns unfamiliar yet astonishingly resilient. What rose from that silence was not simply a return to what had been, but the birth of something entirely new. This is the tale of how Earth remade itself, of how oceans once filled with reptilian giants became nurseries for mammals, of how barren land grew lush again, fed by ash and rain, of how chaos was sculpted into balance, not by design, but by the sheer persistence of life. Welcome to Arcane Skies. If you find yourself drawn into the mystery of deep time, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and telling us where and when you're watching this moment in history unfold. The first seconds after impact were not measured in human terms of hours or days, but in waves of force and fire that swept across the globe. The asteroid's collision released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs, shaking the planet down to its core. The crater it carved into the Yucatan basin was more than 180 kilometers wide, a wound that seared the Earth's crust and filled the air with molten debris. Within moments, fragments of rock, vaporized seawater, and sulfur-rich dust were launched beyond the atmosphere, arcing around the world before falling back as rain of fire. For countless creatures that roamed the forests and plains, the world turned instantly unrecognizable. From the sky, incandescent projectiles cascaded like a storm of meteors, igniting woodlands and grasslands thousands of miles from the epicenter. Flames spread in waves, consuming oxygen, painting the horizon in crimson light and turning night into a furnace. Forests that had stood for millions of years collapsed in hours, their ashes lifted by the heat and carried into the jet stream. It was not only the dinosaurs that faced this hellish storm, but every creature that needed air to breathe, water to drink, and shelter to hide. In a geological blink, entire ecosystems vanished in clouds of smoke. Yet the most devastating consequence was not fire, but darkness. As the atmosphere filled with dust, soot, and vapour, sunlight struggled to reach the surface. Days turned dim, and dimness soon dissolved into night. The Earth's skin cooled rapidly, and photosynthesis, the quiet machinery of green life, stalled. Without sunlight, plants could not grow. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, predators faltered. The food chain that had stretched across every corner of land and sea was fractured like a shattered web. What survived the flames now faced the stillness of hunger. In oceans, the upheaval was equally catastrophic. Shock waves radiated from the point of impact, generating tsunamis taller than skyscrapers that raced across the Proto-Caribbean and Atlantic. Coral reefs, already fragile gardens, were ripped apart. Shorelines collapsed under the weight of saltwater walls, dragging trees, soil, and creatures into the churning depths. Beneath the surface, sulfur and carbon were stirred into circulation, poisoning waters that had once brimmed with plankton and fish. The delicate equilibrium of marine ecosystems was undone in a matter of days, setting the stage for a collapse that would linger for millennia. Still, even amid destruction, the seeds of recovery were being scattered. Not all was erased. Some niches, those small overlooked places in the cracks of the world, remained shielded. Burrowing mammals, no larger than rats, survived by feeding on roots and seeds cached in the earth. Freshwater turtles and crocodilians endured, their metabolism slowed, able to wait out the famine in mud and water. Insects found refuge in rotting wood and buried soil, carrying with them the genetic memory of survival that would one day allow forests to rise again. It was in these dark margins that the first whispers of resilience emerged. The air remained heavy with ash for months, perhaps years. Across continents, temperatures dropped, glaciers in highlands began to creep, and rainfall patterns shifted. The Earth entered what some paleoclimatologists describe as a nuclear winter, a time when the planet's own breath seemed suspended, caught between fire and ice. Plants that had relied on broad leaves withered, while ferns, ancient survivors that had endured earlier cataclysms, spread across open ground. Their spores, carried by the wind, painted the landscape with the first tentative strokes of green. Fossil evidence shows what scientists call a fern spike, a sudden proliferation of these hardy plants immediately after the extinction event. They were the first to reclaim the silence left by towering forests reduced to ash. In the oceans, plankton began a similar march toward recovery. Microscopic algae, the architects of oxygen and the base of the marine food chain, struggled in the darkened waters. Yet certain resilient forms, able to tolerate low light and high acidity, persisted. They multiplied slowly, feeding the smallest creatures, who in turn fed the slightly larger, until, like threads rewoven, the food web began to mend. It was fragile, thin, and prone to collapse, but it was enough to keep the story of life moving forward. Even so, for larger organisms, the outlook was grim. The non-avian dinosaurs, rulers of the Mesozoic, could not adapt quickly enough. Their massive size, once their greatest strength, became a burden in a world stripped of vegetation and prey. Fossil records reveal their disappearance with chilling abruptness, a silence in stone that tells of giants unable to endure famine. Only their winged relatives, the early birds, survived, their smaller bodies and varied diets allowing them to adapt to the new scarcity. Mammals, long suppressed in the shadow of reptilian dominance, found themselves standing at the edge of a new era. Yet this was not a simple story of succession, not a clean handoff from one dynasty to the next. The aftermath was messy, uncertain, and perilous. Many of the survivors clung to existence by the thinnest of margins, their populations bottlenecked, their habitats fragmented. The question was not merely who survived, but how long survival could be sustained in a world still writhing with instability. Climate would oscillate, oceans would acidify, and volcanic activity in regions like India's Deccan Traps would add more layers of disruption. The Earth had been wounded, and its healing was neither swift nor guaranteed. Still, resilience is written into the code of life. The planet had endured extinction before, and it would endure again. From the collapse of ecosystems came opportunities for innovation. The mammals that once crept in shadows would rise into daylight, exploring new ecological roles. The birds that fluttered through scorched skies would diversify into countless forms. The oceans, emptied of ancient reptiles, would become the cradle of new giants millions of years later. The stage was set, though no creature could yet glimpse the performance to come. On the surface of a scarred earth, silence spread like a new kind of atmosphere, broken only by the sound of wind through barren trees and the distant crackle of cooling lava. It was a silence filled not just with endings but with waiting. In that pause lay the possibility of beginnings not yet imagined. And as the world held its breath under veils of ash and shadow, the question lingered: what patterns of life would emerge from such ruin? And how would they shape the landscapes yet to come? In the months that followed the Chicxulub impact, Earth became a planet of contrasts. Above ground, the skies were darkened by soot and ash, a shroud that muted the sun and left the days in a permanent twilight. Beneath the soil, however, life still stirred in secret. burrows dug by mammals, insects, and amphibians became havens where warmth and food scraps allowed small populations to persist. These pockets of survival were invisible to the ruined world above, yet they carried within them the genetic future of entire lineages. The surface was far less forgiving. Fires had burned themselves out, leaving vast tracts of land as blackened wastelands where no tree stood upright. The air smelled of sulphur, a bitter trace of the vaporized rocks and minerals from the impact site. Across continents, soot mixed with rainfall, creating torrents of acid rain that eroded soils and poisoned streams. Rivers once rich with fish were transformed into lifeless flows, their chemistry warped by the sudden infusion of toxins. The Earth's cycles had not ceased, but they had been rewritten into something alien, something most creatures could not endure. For weeks, perhaps even years, the planet lived under the weight of darkness. Estimates suggest that global temperatures plummeted by more than 20 degrees Celsius in certain regions. This sudden chill was not the gentle cold of a seasonal shift, but the harsh freeze of a world deprived of its sun. Photosynthesis collapsed nearly everywhere, and with it the foundations of ecosystems. The fern spike that appeared in the fossil record tells of their uncanny ability to survive when others perished. Their spores could germinate in harsh conditions, thriving in places where soil had been stripped bare. Fields that once carried cycads and conifers became green again, but this was a strange and temporary greenery, the signature of survival rather than abundance. Insects, too, left their quiet mark. They adapted swiftly, some feeding on the dead wood of fallen forests, others surviving by burrowing into the soil where the cold was less severe. Beetles, ants, and termites continued their unseen labour, breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, and keeping the cycle of decomposition alive. Without them, the new forests of ferns and hardy shrubs could not have risen. Each tiny movement of mandibles through bark and soil was a step toward rebuilding Earth's ecological foundation. The oceans, meanwhile, held their own stories of devastation and resilience. The shock waves of the impact had stirred currents that carried sulphur and carbon deep into the seas, creating layers of acidification. Coral reefs, the delicate citadels of marine life, withered almost entirely. Vast stretches of coastline were reduced to barren rock, their biodiversity stripped to almost nothing, and yet, deep within the planktonic world, life clawed its way back. Certain cyanobacteria and algae persisted, using whatever faint light filtered through the darkened waters. Slowly they multiplied, seeding the ocean with the faintest signs of recovery. From these microscopic survivors, entire ecosystems would one day be rebuilt, though at this point the oceans were more like deserts than gardens. What fascinates scientists is the unevenness of recovery. Not all regions of Earth suffered equally. Some areas, shielded by geography or climate, became refuges where life endured in higher numbers. Freshwater habitats, for example, showed surprising resilience compared to the open seas. In lakes and rivers, species of fish, amphibians, and small reptiles found shelter, sustained by algae blooms that could survive with minimal light. These water bodies acted as reservoirs of biodiversity, from which recovery could radiate outward once conditions improved. But recovery was not guaranteed. The Earth remained volatile. In India, the Deccan Traps, a vast region of volcanic activity, erupted with relentless force, pouring lava over thousands of square kilometres. These eruptions released carbon dioxide and sulphur dioxide into the atmosphere, exacerbating the instability left by the asteroid. Some scientists debate the interplay between the impact and the volcanism, questioning whether the combination of both catastrophes created a longer winter than either alone could have achieved. It is a reminder that Earth's history is rarely shaped by a single event, but rather by the collision of multiple forces, each amplifying the other in ways that are both destructive and transformative. Amid this chaos, mammals continued their quiet persistence. They were not yet the masters of the world, but remained survivors on the margins, Most were small, nocturnal, and opportunistic, feeding on seeds, roots, insects, and anything else they could find. Their ability to reproduce quickly, to adapt their diets, and to find shelter underground gave them an advantage that larger animals lacked. Fossil evidence suggests that within a few 100,000 years after the impact, mammalian diversity began to rise sharply. They were not evolving into the grand forms of later epochs yet, but their foundation was being laid in the silence of recovery. Birds, too, began their ascent. Descended from the theropod dinosaurs, they inherited traits that proved invaluable in this altered world. Hollow bones that allowed flight, varied beaks suited to different diets, and the ability to migrate in search of food. The extinction of their larger cousins cleared ecological space for them, and they began to radiate into niches that had once been occupied by other reptiles. In the ashes of devastation, they became the inheritors of the skies. Each step of recovery carried within it echoes of loss. Whole lineages of plants, reptiles, and marine creatures vanished completely, leaving behind no descendants. Their absence shaped the new ecosystems as much as the survival of others did. For every mammal that thrived, there were dozens of species that vanished. For every bird that took flight, entire families of winged reptiles had fallen. Earth was not simply reborn but rewritten, its biological script altered forever. As the skies slowly cleared over the span of decades, sunlight returned in hesitant shafts, piercing the murk like beams through cathedral windows. The first true forests after the impact began to form, seeded not only by ferns but by pioneering trees such as willows and palms. Rivers carried seeds downstream, scattering life across floodplains, and animals followed. With each passing century the earth greened again, though the memory of fire and darkness was etched into every layer of soil and stone. And yet, recovery is never a straight line. Climate fluctuations, volcanic gases, and lingering scarcity meant that each gain was fragile, always threatened by relapse. The ecosystems of the Paleocene, the epoch that followed the Cretaceous, were patchworks, mosaics of renewal and ruin. Still, they carried the promise of resilience, a promise that life would continue not as it was before, but in forms unimagined. Standing at the edge of this precarious new world, one could wonder, how would these small survivors, mammals in burrows, birds in skeletal forests, plankton in shadowed seas, transform the Earth from a planet of absence into one of abundance again? As the Paleocene dawned, the Earth was still bearing the scars of impact, yet life began weaving new threads across the landscape. The silence that had once blanketed the planet now gave way to tentative sounds. The rustle of ferns reclaiming open ground, the calls of small birds in the skeletal forests, the trickle of streams finding new courses carved by floods and landslides. In the absence of the titanic dinosaurs, the stage was open for other actors to experiment with roles they had long been denied. Mammals were among the most surprising figures of this new age. Before the impact, they had lived mostly in shadows, confined to small sizes and obscure niches, overshadowed by reptilian giants. Now, the world was theirs to explore. Fossils from early Paleocene layers reveal an astonishing increase in mammalian diversity within just a few 100,000 years. Creatures that resembled shrews, opossums, and hedgehogs began to spread across continents, each exploiting opportunities left behind by extinction. Their small bodies were not weaknesses but strengths, allowing them to breed rapidly, adapt swiftly, and fill gaps in food chains fractured by catastrophe. Forests, though sparse compared to their Cretaceous predecessors, provided sanctuaries for these creatures. Willows, palms, and newly evolving flowering plants began to dominate landscapes once ruled by cycads and conifers. These plants offered seeds and fruits, resources that would become the foundation for new ecological relationships. Mammals capable of chewing tougher, plant material gained an advantage, while others adapted to diets rich in insects or carrion. Every adaptation was a negotiation with scarcity, and every success rewrote the evolutionary trajectory of Earth's biosphere. Birds, the airborne survivors of the catastrophe, were also diversifying rapidly. Some resembled the ground dwellers of later epochs, scratching through leaf litter in search of seeds. Others took to the skies in great flocks, their hollow bones granting the mobility that became crucial in an unstable climate. Fossil evidence suggests the emergence of early waterfowl and shorebirds during this period, probing mudflats for insects and crustaceans. These avian pioneers were the first hints of the vast variety of forms that would later dominate nearly every ecosystem on Earth. In the oceans, the recovery was uneven but unmistakable. After years of darkness and acidity, light once again filtered through surface waters, and plankton began their steady return. Tiny foraminifera, single-celled organisms with delicate shells, appeared in abundance, their fossils marking one of the clearest signs of life's resilience after the catastrophe. With them came small fish, then larger predators. It was as if the marine food web had been torn apart but was now being stitched back together, thread by thread, by the persistence of microscopic architects. Coral reefs, however, lagged far behind. Once vibrant hubs of biodiversity, they remained diminished for millions of years, a reminder that not all ecosystems heal at the same pace. The Deccan Traps eruptions, though waning, still haunted the atmosphere with sulfur and carbon dioxide. These gases warmed the Earth after its long winter, shifting climates in unpredictable ways. Where once the planet had shivered under a veil of ash, it now began to sweat under greenhouse conditions. Swamps expanded, forests thickened, and rainfall patterns altered landscapes in cycles of drought and flood. Creatures that had adapted to scarcity now faced a different challenge: abundance that came with instability. Each fluctuation tested the resilience of species still recovering from bottlenecked populations. One of the most striking features of this time was the emergence of ecological experiments. In South America, isolated by seas, mammals unique to the continent evolved into strange forms, small hoofed creatures that grazed on the first Paleocene meadows, or arboreal mammals that explored the canopies of regenerating forests. In North America and Eurasia, insectivorous and omnivorous mammals spread rapidly, accompanied by reptiles like crocodilians that endured through adaptation to waterlogged habitats. On islands, avian giants appeared, large, flightless birds that filled roles once dominated by predatory dinosaurs. They stalked through undergrowth with sharp beaks, reminders that birds were not merely fragile survivors but heirs to a carnivorous legacy. The geological record preserves these transformations with astonishing clarity. Layers of sediment from this epoch reveal pollen grains that mark the spread of flowering plants, while bones and teeth embedded in ancient riverbeds chart the rise of mammalian diversity. Fossils of early primates, tiny and delicate, hint at the beginnings of lineages that would one day question the story of their own survival. Each discovery offers a fragment of a puzzle, a reminder that the aftermath of the Chicxulub impact was not only about destruction, but about possibility. Still, the memory of extinction lingered in every ecological niche. With the dinosaurs gone, there was space, but there was also danger. Predation pressures changed, food chains were unstable, and ecosystems remained vulnerable to collapse. A single drought could erase a fragile patch of forest. A flood could wipe out a nascent population of small mammals. Recovery was a balancing act, and Earth wavered between renewal and ruin with each passing millennium. What stands out is not just the return of the life, but the speed with which it began to innovate. In less than 1 million years, evolutionary pathways that had been constrained for tens of millions suddenly expanded. New teeth shapes evolved to process seeds and nuts. New limb structures adapted for climbing and burrowing. New behaviors arose to exploit ecological gaps. Evolution, driven by both necessity and opportunity, accelerated in ways that reshaped the biosphere. Where once giant reptiles had dominated, now small creatures multiplied into forms of startling variety. The Earth itself bore witness to this transformation through its landscapes. Craters slowly eroded, rivers carved new valleys through ash-rich soils, and mountains continued their slow rise. Every geological shift created new habitats, and every habitat became an arena for survival. What had once been deserts of ash grew green with pioneering plants. What had been lifeless seas swirled again with plankton blooms visible even from the surface. The planet, scarred but not broken, revealed its capacity to host renewal, and so the question shifted from whether life could survive to how it would flourish. Would mammals continue their steady climb to dominance, or would reptiles find new ways to reclaim power? Would the seas remain fragile, or would they give rise to creatures rivaling the marine reptiles of old? The uncertainty was as vast as the opportunities, and each path led toward futures unimaginable to the species living through them. In the hush of the Paleocene forests, among ferns and paths swaying in humid winds, creatures moved cautiously but with purpose. The echoes of thunder lizards had faded, but in their absence the air carried different sounds, the scratching of small feet on bark, the flutter of early birds, the distant croak of amphibians in swollen rivers. Life was no longer a spectacle of giants. It was a tapestry of the small, the quick, the adaptable. From these beginnings, the blueprint of the modern world was being drafted in quiet strokes. And yet, as ecosystems stitched themselves back together, new tensions brewed beneath the surface. How would these fragile threads withstand the shifting climates and restless geology of a planet still unsettled by catastrophe? The early Paleocene world was unlike any landscape known today, a planet in transition where the remnants of catastrophe mingled with the signs of rebirth. Forests stretched across floodplains, but their canopies were thin and uneven, filled not with towering giants of the Mesozoic, but with a patchwork of pioneer trees and shrubs. Ferns, palms, and willows defined the undergrowth, while broad-leaved angiosperms, the flowering plants that had begun their quiet rise during the Cretaceous, now spread across continents almost unchecked. Their seeds, carried by wind, water, and the beaks of emerging bird lineages, seeded the scars of the earth with unexpected bursts of green. In these scattered forests, the mammals of the Paleocene found both opportunity and peril. They were not the megafauna that would later roam the Eocene plains, but creatures of modest size, rarely larger than modern cats or dogs. Yet they were versatile, capable of filling roles abandoned by dinosaurs. Some, with sharp teeth adapted for insectivory, scurried through leaf litter. Others developed broader molars, suited to grinding seeds and shoots. Already, evolutionary experiments were unfolding in dozens of directions, shaping the roots of future lineages. Primates, ungulates, carnivores, all hidden in small, unassuming forms. Birds, too, claimed their inheritance. Descendants of theropod dinosaurs, they spread across habitats with astonishing speed. The skies once ruled by pterosaurs were now filled with flocks of early avians, many resembling ducks, shorebirds, and primitive raptors. Some species remained capable flyers, while others grew heavy and grounded, evolving into giant flightless predators. In South America and parts of Eurasia, these terror birds would eventually emerge, towering over small mammals with hooked beaks designed for striking. Though the true giants came later, their Paleocene ancestors were already exploring the potential of a world without reptilian overlords. The oceans, meanwhile, carried their own narrative of rebirth. Plankton, the invisible architects of marine food chains, regained their dominance in the sunlit layers of water. The return of foraminifera and coccolithophores, tiny organisms whose fossilized shells record this recovery, signaled the slow revival of productivity in the seas. With them came the resurgence of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. The great marine reptiles had vanished, but sharks, resilient as ever, quickly reclaimed their role as apex predators. Their fossil teeth, scattered across ancient seabeds, tell of species adapting to new prey in seas that were at once familiar and utterly transformed. The climate of the Paleocene was unstable yet trending warmer. After the cold shock of the post-impact nuclear winter, greenhouse gases released by the Deccan Trap's volcanism began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily, pushing global temperatures upward. Rainforests thickened in equatorial regions, while temperate forests crept toward higher latitudes. Ice, once expanding in the shadows of the impact, receded, leaving Earth without permanent polar caps. The planet, recovering from devastation, was becoming lush again, though its lushness carried the seeds of volatility. Geological activity also played its part. Tectonic plates shifted, carving new mountain ranges and altering ocean currents. In the North Atlantic, rifts were beginning to widen, shaping the ocean basins that would later dominate the modern map. These movements influenced weather patterns, carrying moisture to some regions while leaving others in drought. The dynamic interplay between land, sea, and sky meant that ecosystems were never static. They were always in flux, testing the resilience of the species that inhabited them. One of the most intriguing aspects of this period is the story told by pollen and spores preserved in sediments. Paleobotanists studying these microscopic fossils have reconstructed a vivid picture of recovery. Ferns dominated immediately after the impact, followed by a gradual rise of angiosperms. Flowering plants, with their capacity for rapid reproduction and mutualistic relationships with pollinators, thrived in disturbed environments. Their spread created opportunities for insects, whose diversity also rebounded in surprising ways. Fossilized amber from Paleocene forests captures ants, bees, and beetles frozen in time, tiny witnesses to the rebirth of ecosystems. These insects, in turn, supported the mammals and birds that depended on them, weaving new links in the fragile food web. Amid this web of recovery, predators began to reassert their role. With non-avian dinosaurs gone, mammalian carnivores took tentative steps into niches once guarded by tyrannosaurs and raptors. They were small, creatures like myacids, ancestral to later dogs and cats, but their sharp teeth and agile bodies made them formidable hunters of insects, reptiles, and small mammals. Their rise marked the beginning of a long evolutionary arms race, one that would shape the dynamic between predator and prey for millions of years. The fossil record shows not just survival but experimentation. In South America, isolated from other continents, mammals evolved along distinct lines, giving rise to strange herbivores with hoof-like toes and carnivores unrelated to those elsewhere in the world. This isolation made the continent a natural laboratory for evolutionary innovation. In Europe and North America, lineages of mammals spread into newly opened spaces, setting the stage for diversification into larger forms in later epochs. The Paleocene was, in many ways, the rehearsal for the great explosion of diversity that would define the Eocene. Still, life in the Paleocene was not free from danger. Volcanic eruptions continued to belch gases into the skies, shifting the climate in abrupt pulses. Sea levels rose and fell, redrawing coastlines and drowning habitats. Earthquakes reshaped valleys and river systems. Recovery was a fragile process, always at risk of reversal. Yet through these oscillations, life continued to weave its tapestry, responding to each disruption with new adaptations, new forms, and new strategies for survival. From the perspective of deep time, what is remarkable is the resilience of Earth's systems. The asteroid impact had erased 75% of species, yet within a few million years, ecosystems were vibrant again. This resilience was not uniform or even fair. Many lineages were lost forever, their absence reshaping the course of evolution. But the persistence of others, mammals, birds, insects, plankton, ensured that the planet's story continued. Standing in a Paleocene forest, one would not see dinosaurs but a new cast, small mammals darting among roots, birds filling the air with calls, insects buzzing in shafts of sunlight that pierced the canopy. The earth was quieter than in the Cretaceous, yet its silence was deceptive. Beneath the surface of every leaf, within every burrow and across every tide pool, evolution was at work, experimenting with possibilities that would one day redefine life's grandeur. The earth was no longer the world of giants. It was a world of beginnings, a crucible in which resilience and innovation would shape the path forward. But as life reclaimed its foothold, new challenges loomed on the horizon. How would these fragile ecosystems respond to the warming pulse that was beginning to sweep across the globe? The warming pulse of the Paleocene was like a slow breath exhaled by the planet, a release of buried heat and gases that seeped into the atmosphere and transformed the landscapes once again. The volcanic eruptions of the Deccan Traps had not yet fallen silent when the Earth began to tilt into a greenhouse state. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily, oceans absorbed the heat, and rainforests thickened across equatorial zones. This was not an immediate change, but rather a gradual reshaping that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, and life adapted step by step, as if improvising to an unpredictable rhythm. Forests grew denser, their canopies layered with broad leaves that captured sunlight and created shadowed realms below. Angiosperms, flowering plants, spread deeper into continents, their fruits and seeds offering new resources for evolving animals. With this spread came a remarkable partnership. Insects that had endured the catastrophe now found themselves indispensable. Bees pollinated flowers, beetles drilled into bark, ants formed colonies that altered soil chemistry. In every corner of the Paleocene forests, these small architects played roles as crucial as the towering trees themselves. Without their constant movement, decomposition, and pollination, the forest could not have flourished. Within these habitats, mammals began to take more daring steps toward diversity. Fossilized jaws and teeth tell of species experimenting with new diets. Some developed sharper molars to chew tough vegetation, while others retained slicing teeth for omnivory. The small insectivores of the earliest Paleocene were now joined by larger creatures, dog-sized herbivores, rodent-like scavengers, and early ungulates with hooves adapted for moving through soft forest soils. The variety of forms hinted at evolutionary ambition. Mammals were no longer confined to marginal niches, but were actively testing the limits of possibility. Primates, still tiny and unassuming, emerged in this epoch as well. Their fossils reveal grasping hands, flexible ankles, and forward-facing eyes, adaptations suited for life in the trees. These early primates were no more than shadows in the forest canopy, yet they marked a lineage destined to change the course of Earth's history. For now, they were simply survivors, clinging to branches, eating fruits and insects, and avoiding predators. But their presence demonstrates how, even in a world dominated by chance, the seeds of future destinies can lie hidden in small, fragile forms. Birds expanded into an extraordinary range of shapes and behaviours. Some remained small, filling the skies with flocks that fed on seeds and insects. Others, particularly in isolated regions, became large, flightless hunters. These proto-terra birds were not yet the apex predators they would become in later epochs, but their growing size and sharp beaks were early experiments in avian dominance. In wetlands, waterfowl and shorebirds thrived, exploiting the abundance of fish and invertebrates in lakes and rivers. The skies, once shared with pterosaurs, were now exclusively theirs, and they evolved to claim every niche, from swift flyers darting above the canopy to heavy-footed hunters stalking beneath it. The oceans told a more complex story. Plankton populations had returned, but marine ecosystems remained fragile. Coral reefs still struggled to recover, leaving coastal zones relatively barren compared to their Cretaceous richness. Yet sharks, rays, and bony fish found opportunities in this simpler web. With marine reptiles gone, sharks reasserted themselves as top predators. The fossil record from this time reveals an abundance of shark teeth scattered in sediments, evidence of both diversity and dominance. In deeper waters, primitive whales had not yet emerged, but the groundwork for marine mammal evolution was being laid in small semi-aquatic mammals along shorelines. The oceans were becoming laboratories of renewal, though their experiments were slower and subtler than those on land. The climate itself shaped evolutionary pathways. The warmth that spread across the globe allowed rainforests to expand into regions that today would be temperate. Fossils from the Paleocene Arctic reveal evidence of lush forests growing in what is now permafrost. Giant dawn redwoods and swamp-loving plants thrived under long periods of daylight in summer and dim twilight in winter. These polar forests created unique habitats for animals that had to adapt not only to warmth, but to seasonal extremes of light. Such discoveries challenge modern imagination. An Arctic not of ice and snow, but of humid forests alive with insects and small mammals. Yet this warming was not without danger. Fluctuating carbon levels meant periods of instability, where ecosystems could shift rapidly. Droughts followed floods, and species adapted to abundance could be wiped out by scarcity. This pattern forced resilience and innovation. Mammals that could store fat, reproduce quickly, or change their diets had the advantage. Birds capable of long migrations survived better than those tied to a single habitat. Insects with flexible life cycles expanded while specialists perished. Evolution favoured the versatile, the opportunistic, and the restless. The fossil record from this time captures a paradox. Diversity was rising, yet it was precarious. Populations were still recovering from bottlenecks, and extinction risks remained high. A volcanic eruption, a shift in rainfall, or a sudden oceanic event could erase entire lineages. But for every loss, new forms emerged, and over millions of years, the balance tilted steadily toward renewal. Geologists studying the sediments of this epoch often describe the layers as palimpsests, records written over one another, with traces of catastrophe beneath signs of recovery. Charcoal from ancient fires mingles with pollen from new forests. Bones of vanished reptiles lie beneath the teeth of emerging mammals. The earth itself remembers both destruction and resilience, binding them together in stone. To walk through these layers is to witness not a clean break between worlds, but a constant dialogue between what was lost and what was born. By the later Paleocene, mammals had already taken significant steps toward dominance. Some lineages began to grow larger, testing the ecological roles of mid-sized herbivores and predators. Though none rivaled the giants of the Mesozoic, their ambitions were evident in every adaptation. The quiet world of the early Paleocene was giving way to landscapes filled with movement, sound, and conflict. Evolution was no longer about mere survival. It was about competition for territory, food, and opportunity. Yet even as ecosystems flourished, there lingered an underlying question. How stable was this recovery? The Earth's climate was still volatile, and deeper in its future, another sudden warming pulse, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, waited to test the resilience of these fragile systems. Life had survived the Chicxulub impact, but could it withstand the planet's own restless cycles? The forest thickened, the ocean stirred, and the skies filled with new wings. But beneath the surface of this revival, the Earth was already preparing its next trial, one that would challenge not only the survivors of the Paleocene, but the very balance of ecosystems themselves. By the middle of the Paleocene, nearly 10 million years after the impact, the world no longer resembled the desolate, ash-covered planet that had once seemed so close to lifeless. Forests had expanded into rich mosaics of greenery, spreading across plains and river valleys, even climbing into highland regions where the soil had been replenished with volcanic minerals. The earth was alive with sound again, the buzz of insects, the calls of birds, and the soft footfalls of mammals moving through undergrowth. Yet beneath this sense of abundance lay a precarious balance. Life had returned, but its foothold was not yet secure, and the forces of geology and climate remained unpredictable companions. The animals that now roamed the Paleocene landscapes were unlike those that had dominated the Cretaceous. Mammals had diversified into dozens of forms, many still small, but already exploring pathways toward larger, more specialized bodies. There were early ungulates, hoofed herbivores, that browsed leaves and shoots, shaping the growth of forests by selective feeding. There were insectivores, with elongated snouts and sharp claws, digging into soil and rotting logs for beetles and ants. Rodent-like mammals scurried through branches, gnawing on seeds with ever-growing incisors. These were not yet the dominant megafauna of later epochs, but they were establishing the rhythms of life that would define the mammalian era. Predators, too, were rising in prominence. Small carnivorous mammals descended from miacids stalked the shadows of the forests. They were quick, agile hunters, preying on insects, lizards, and other mammals. Though they lacked the size of later carnivores, their role was pivotal. By regulating prey populations, they helped shape ecosystems still vulnerable to imbalance. Birds filled predator niches as well. Some remained light and fast, diving at insects, while others grew into large, flightless hunters. The ancestors of the formidable terror birds were beginning to explore the possibilities of land dominance, their beaks sharp and their strides long. These birds carried within them echoes of their dinosaurian ancestry, a reminder that survival had not erased the memory of power. The oceans mirrored this pattern of experimentation and renewal. Plankton blooms pulsed through surface waters, feeding shoals of small fish that in turn drew the attention of sharks. Rays skimmed the shallows, while early forms of seabirds dived beneath waves. Yet the seas remained haunted by instability. Coral reefs, once thriving, were still diminished, their recovery slow. Where vibrant cities of biodiversity had existed before, there now lingered sparse outcroppings of life, fragile and vulnerable to shifts in temperature and acidity. It would take millions of years before reefs regained their former splendor, leaving open ocean ecosystems simpler but resilient. The climate during this time trended toward warmth, though punctuated by fluctuations. The release of greenhouse gases from volcanic activity continued to drive global temperatures upward, creating environments unlike those of the present day. Rainforests spread across latitudes that are now temperate, and polar regions bore forests of dawn redwoods, alders, and swamp plants. The Arctic, shrouded in months of darkness and months of twilight, was warm enough to host crocodilians and turtles, creatures unthinkable in the frozen expanses of the modern North. Fossilized remains of these animals, preserved in layers of ancient silt, reveal the extraordinary adaptability of life to climates alien to our imagination. One of the most striking patterns of the Paleocene was the uneven pace of recovery across different regions. In some areas, ecosystems thrived with dense forests and rich faunas. In others, scars of the impact remained more visible, with sparser vegetation and limited diversity. Isolation played a crucial role in shaping these differences. South America, separated by seas, became a cradle of unique evolutionary experiments. Here, mammals evolved into odd hoofed herbivores with forms not seen anywhere else, along with carnivorous lineages that diverge from their northern relatives. These experiments were products of seclusion, their destinies unfolding in parallel worlds. Europe and North America, connected by land bridges at times, fostered their own forms of diversity. Small primates appeared, testing arboreal life in expanding forests. Early ungulates grew steadily larger, browsing leaves and shaping plant communities. Carnivores remained modest in size but increasingly specialized. In Asia, ecosystems combined influences from multiple continents, with lineages that would later migrate outward to dominate much of the Old World. Each region carried its own evolutionary rhythm, orchestrated by isolation, climate, and the lingering memory of extinction. Plant life was not merely a backdrop to this story, but a protagonist. Angiosperms had become dominant, their flowers attracting pollinators that diversified alongside them. Bees, flies, and beetles thrived in forests alive with blossoms, ensuring the reproduction of plants while feeding themselves and other animals. The partnership between flowering plants and insects accelerated evolutionary creativity, producing endless variations of colour, shape, and scent. In this symbiosis lay the foundations of modern ecosystems, a collaboration forged in the crucible of survival after catastrophe. Amid these patterns of growth, the Earth remained restless. Volcanic eruptions continued in various regions, sometimes disrupting local climates with ash and sulfur, sometimes enriching soils with minerals that spurred plant growth. Earthquakes reshaped valleys, while rising seas flooded coastal plains. Each disturbance threatened fragile communities but also created opportunities for adaptation. Life in the Paleocene was shaped by resilience, a constant dance between destruction and renewal. The fossil record reveals this dynamic vividly. Layers of sediment capture sudden die-offs, followed by bursts of diversification. In one stratum, evidence of drought-driven extinctions. In the next, pollen and spores signalling the return of lush forests. These alternating patterns remind us that recovery was never linear but cyclical, driven by the interplay of planetary forces and the persistence of life. By the later Paleocene, mammals were beginning to push the boundaries of size. While still modest compared to the giants of later epochs, some herbivores reached the size of modern sheep or deer. These larger forms marked a critical transition. Ecosystems were stable enough to support creatures that demanded greater amounts of food and space. The presence of such mammals hinted at what was to come in the Eocene, when true megafauna would emerge to dominate plains and forests. The world of the Paleocene was a laboratory of resilience. Every creature, from the smallest beetle to the rising mammals, carried within it the legacy of survival and the burden of adaptation. They were heirs to a planet scarred by catastrophe, yet they were also architects of its renewal. Evolution in this epoch was a negotiation with uncertainty, a constant testing of forms and strategies against the shifting backdrop of climate and geology. As lush forests thickened and new predators sharpened their skills, the question grew sharper. How long could this fragile balance hold, and what new forces might soon tilt the scales again? The later Paleocene carried with it a sense of momentum, as though the Earth, having endured the silence of extinction, now surged forward with restless creativity. The landscapes of this epoch were lush and humid, dominated by dense forests that stretched across continents and gave the world a green, breathing skin. In these forests, life moved with renewed energy. Mammals grew bolder, birds diversified into astonishing forms, and plants spread into niches once unimaginable. Yet every step toward abundance was shadowed by volatility, for the Earth's climate and geology remained unpredictable. The mammals of this time were no longer limited to the size of rodents or shrews. Many had grown larger, testing the boundaries of what the recovering ecosystems could sustain. Early ungulates, the hoofed mammals, became increasingly prominent. They browsed on leaves, shoots, and fruits, shaping the vegetation around them through their feeding habits. Their bodies, though still relatively small compared to the giants of later epochs, represented the first stirrings of mammalian dominance. Fossil evidence from North America and Europe reveals creatures with elongated limbs and differentiated teeth, traits that foreshadowed the eventual rise of deer, horses, and other grazers millions of years later. Carnivorous mammals evolved alongside them, keeping pace with the herbivores in a constant evolutionary arms race. The ancestors of future dogs and cats, small agile predators descended from miacids, prowled the undergrowth. They were hunters of opportunity, capable of taking down small mammals, reptiles, and birds. Their sharp teeth and stealthy movements mark the early chapters of a story that would eventually produce the apex predators of later ages. Birds also played a role in predation. In South America, early flightless birds were beginning to explore the potential of their size and strength, prefiguring the terror birds that would later dominate. They stalked through the forests on long legs, their beaks curved like blades, blending the elegance of avian lineage with the brutality of their dinosaurian ancestry. The forests themselves were changing in profound ways. Angiosperms had not only become dominant, but were diversifying into endless varieties of form. Trees with broad leaves shaded forest floors, vines curled upward toward the light, and shrubs spread through clearings. With the plants came insects in dazzling abundance. Fossilized amber from this time reveals bees, wasps, flies, and beetles, many closely resembling modern species. These insects were crucial, for they ensured the reproduction of flowering plants, spreading pollen as they fed, and in turn sustaining countless animal species that depended on fruits, seeds, and leaves. The Paleocene was not merely an age of recovery, it was an age of innovation, in which symbiosis between plants and insects created new ecological networks. Oceans, though slower to recover, were regaining their complexity. Plankton blooms surged through surface waters, restoring oxygen levels and feeding the base of marine food chains. With this resurgence came fish, mollusks, and crustaceans. Sharks flourished as top predators, their teeth scattering across seabeds like silent fossils of dominance. In coastal regions, birds adapted to aquatic life. Early forms of waterfowl and waders probed shorelines for prey, linking land and sea in the flow of energy. Coral reefs, still diminished, remained fragile, but the oceans as a whole pulsed with life once again. The climate continued its steady march toward warmth. Global temperatures climbed higher than modern averages, creating environments alien to contemporary eyes. The Arctic was covered not by ice but by forests of dawn redwoods and alders. Crocodilians basked in high-latitude rivers. Turtles swam in swamps where today the ground lies frozen. Such ecosystems reveal how profoundly climate shapes life. Creatures that we now associate with the tropics once thrived in polar zones. Fossils from these regions remind us that Earth's climates have always been dynamic, shifting dramatically across epochs. But with warmth came instability. Rising carbon dioxide from lingering volcanic activity and the natural rhythms of Earth's systems set the stage for fluctuations in rainfall and temperature. Some regions became wetter, others drier. Floodplains expanded with swollen rivers, while elsewhere drought cracked the soil. These shifts forced species to adapt quickly or perish. Mammals with flexible diets, capable of feeding on seeds, fruits, and insects, fared better than specialists. Birds that could migrate endured where stationary species declined. Insects with short life cycles evolved rapidly, ensuring their dominance in changing habitats. Evolution favoured versatility, rewarding creatures that could adjust their behaviour and biology to uncertain conditions. Isolated continents became laboratories for evolutionary experimentation. South America, cut off from North America, hosted lineages found nowhere else. Herbivorous mammals with unique dentitions, carnivores unrelated to those of the north, and primitive primates that crept through trees. Africa too began to foster its own distinct fauna, with early ancestors of elephants and other large mammals slowly taking shape. In Asia, vast forests nurtured small primates and insectivores that would one day spread outward to influence the wider world. Each continent was a theatre of independent innovation, its inhabitants sculpted by the opportunities and constraints of geography. The fossil record offers glimpses into these experiments, like windows opened briefly into vanished forests. Tiny primate fossils reveal grasping fingers and forward-facing eyes, adaptations for climbing and navigating complex canopies. Their presence suggests that the arboreal life of the Paleocene was already fostering intelligence and agility. Fossilized teeth of early ungulates show the gradual adaptation to new diets, molars broadening to grind tougher vegetation. Bird fossils, both winged and flightless, testify to the rapid filling of ecological niches. Each bone, each tooth, each imprint in stone is a fragment of a larger story, the persistence of life in the face of upheaval. And yet, the memory of extinction was never far. The absence of non-avian dinosaurs was a silence still echoing in ecosystems. No predator filled the niche of the tyrannosaur. No herbivore rivaled the scale of a sauropod. The Earth was a different place, not merely in composition but in scale. The giants were gone, replaced by smaller, quicker, more adaptable creatures. It was a world less spectacular in size but richer in diversity of form. As the Paleocene neared its close, the stage was being set for one of the most dramatic climatic events in Earth's history, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a sudden and extreme warming pulse that would test the resilience of every ecosystem on the planet. The world, already warm, would become hotter still, seas would surge, and ecosystems would be forced to transform in the face of rapid change. The survivors of the Chicxulub impact had proven their ability to endure catastrophe. But would they withstand the planet's own fevered breath? The forests thickened, rivers meandered, and animals pressed forward into new forms. But beneath this apparent stability lay tremors of change, a reminder that Earth's story is never static, that every recovery carries within it the seeds of another trial waiting just beyond the horizon. As the Paleocene drew toward its end, the planet stood on the threshold of yet another transformation. For millions of years, Earth had recovered from the Chicxulub catastrophe with quiet persistence, weaving its shattered ecosystems into patterns of green forests, diverse mammals, and oceans stirring with renewed life. Yet just as balance seemed possible, the rhythms of the planet began to quicken. Deep within the Earth, and high in its atmosphere, forces gathered that would culminate in one of the most dramatic climatic events in history, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM. The world was already warmer than ours, humid and lush, with forests stretching into polar regions. Crocodilians lounged in Arctic rivers, and palm trees swayed under skies that never saw snow. But the pattern was something different, a fever that gripped the planet and forced every species into a new negotiation with survival. Scientists believed that this warming pulse was triggered by an enormous release of carbon into the atmosphere and oceans, perhaps from volcanic eruptions, the destabilization of methane hydrates in seafloor sediments, or even both working together. Whatever the cause, the effect was staggering. Within a few tens of thousands of years, an instant in geological time, global temperatures spiked by at least 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. This sudden heatwave transformed landscapes everywhere. Rainforests thickened, becoming tangled labyrinths of vines and leaves. The Arctic, already green, became subtropical, its swamps echoing with the croaks of amphibians and the buzz of insects. Sea levels rose as ice vanished from mountaintops and glaciers, drowning low-lying coasts. Oceans absorbed much of the released carbon, leading to acidification that devastated shell-building organisms. The fragile reefs that had been recovering since the extinction crisis were once again imperiled. Marine sediments from this time bear the telltale marks of crisis. Thin layers where the shells of foraminifera dissolve into chalky absence, silent testimony to oceans too corrosive for them to endure. On land, mammals responded in ways both surprising and profound. Fossil records show that many species shrank in size during the PETM, a phenomenon known as dwarfing. Creatures that had been steadily increasing in stature suddenly reversed course, producing smaller descendants better suited to the heat. Scientists suggest that smaller bodies were advantageous in hotter climates, allowing animals to regulate temperature more efficiently and requiring less food in ecosystems strained by change. Among these shrinking species were the ancestors of horses, primates, and other lineages that would later dominate the Eocene. Their diminutive forms during the PETM serve as a reminder that survival often means adaptation in unexpected directions. Forests during this time grew dense and diverse, their canopies filled with insects and birds, their floors patrolled by mammals both small and quick. Fruit-bearing trees flourished, feeding primates that leapt through branches and ungulates that browsed on tender shoots. Insects multiplied, their short lifespans and rapid reproduction allowing them to thrive even in shifting climates. Ants, bees, and beetles forged deeper partnerships with plants, accelerating the evolutionary dance that had begun in earlier epochs. The Petten was not merely a trial of endurance, it was also a crucible of innovation, pressing life into forms that would shape the future. The oceans, however, were less forgiving. Acidification rippled through food chains, wiping out many benthic foraminifera and stressing marine ecosystems already vulnerable. Fish populations shifted, and sharks, always opportunistic, adjusted their diets and ranges. The absence of marine reptiles left ecological space for mammals to move into aquatic life. Small, semi-aquatic creatures along the shores, already adapted to foraging in both land and water, began their slow evolutionary journey toward what would become whales. The Petten thus carried within its chaos the seeds of one of Earth's most extraordinary transformations, the return of mammals to the sea. The geological record of this event is etched in sediments worldwide. Thin red layers rich in clay and organic matter tell of soils leached by acid rains and floods. Isotopic signatures of carbon reveal a sudden spike, a fingerprint of greenhouse gases released in massive quantities. Fossils capture both the losses and the adaptations, vanished lineages of foraminifera, shrunken skeletons of mammals, pollen from tropical plants found at high latitudes. Together they form a mosaic of change, a record of a planet forced into accelerated transformation. For the mammals navigating this world, survival meant agility, not just in movement, but in diet, behavior, and reproduction. Omnivores thrived, able to shift their food sources as ecosystems fluctuated. Arboreal mammals found refuge in the canopies, while burrowing species escaped heat by retreating underground. Primates, though still small and relatively obscure, adapted by feeding on fruits and insects, their grasping hands and forward-facing eyes giving them advantages in forests growing ever more intricate. Each adaptation was a thread woven into the tapestry of resilience, shaping lineages that would carry forward long after the fever of the Petten had passed. For plants, the event was both destructive and generative. Heat and rainfall shifts altered the ranges of species, pushing some into extinction while allowing others to spread into new territories. The fossil record shows tropical and subtropical plants flourishing at high latitudes, suggesting forests of extraordinary density and diversity. These lush habitats, though products of crisis, became arenas for rapid evolution, where insects, birds, and mammals forged relationships that would echo through future epochs. Yet the Petten was not only an ecological upheaval, it was also a test of Earth's systems themselves. The carbon cycle, the climate, the oceans, all were strained to extremes. Recovery would take hundreds of thousands of years, during which ecosystems would rebuild, adapt, and innovate. The event offers a glimpse into the resilience of life, but also into its vulnerability, a reminder that rapid environmental change leaves few untouched. As the Paleocene gave way to the Eocene, the fever of the Petten marked both an ending and a beginning. The creatures that endured its heatwave emerged into a world transformed, one where forests were richer, mammals more diverse, and oceans poised to host entirely new giants. It was a world that no longer bore the shadow of the Chicxulub impact directly, but was instead defined by the legacies of survival and the fresh challenges of a restless planet. And as the warmth of the Petten spread across the globe, one question lingered in the air like heat itself. Would the innovations born in crisis be enough to carry life into the stability of a new age, or would the fever break only to reveal new vulnerabilities waiting just ahead? When the fever of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum reached its peak, the Earth became almost unrecognizable. What had once been a warm but relatively stable planet was now a greenhouse world, its forests steaming with humidity, its seas rising higher than at any time in millions of years. Across continents, rivers swelled beyond their banks, swamps expanded, and low-lying coastal plains disappeared beneath the tide. For animals and plants alike, this was a crucible of adaptation, a time when survival meant constant adjustment to climates that shifted not across millennia, but within the span of lifetimes. In these sweltering forests, mammals continued their remarkable expansion. Fossils from this period reveal an astonishing variety of forms. Small, deer-like ungulates browsed on ferns and young shoots, their delicate limbs adapted to moving through dense vegetation. Early perissodactyls, ancestors of horses, tapirs, and rhinos, made their first appearances, modest in size but significant in their potential. Their teeth and jaws reveal adaptations for grinding fibrous plants, evidence that they were already beginning to specialize in herbivory. Even primates, still tiny compared to later species, diversified rapidly, testing life in different parts of the canopy. With forward-facing eyes and nimble fingers, they leapt from branch to branch, feeding on fruits that flourished in the heat. This was also the age of mammalian migration. The warmth of the PEPM opened pathways across continents that had once been barriers. Land bridges between North America, Europe, and Asia became conduits for dispersal, allowing species to spread and mingle. Fossil evidence suggests that early horses, primates, and even small carnivores crossed these bridges, exchanging genetic diversity and shaping the evolutionary trajectory of entire lineages. The PEPM, destructive as it was, created a global exchange, a mingling of faunas that accelerated the rise of modern mammalian families. Predators adapted alongside their prey. Small carnivorous mammals prowled the shadows, their teeth sharpened for slicing flesh. Birds grew bolder, with some lineages evolving into powerful hunters. In South America, isolated from other continents, the ancestors of terror birds were beginning to grow larger, taking on roles once filled by predatory dinosaurs. With their hooked beaks and strong legs, they stalked smaller mammals through forests and grasslands, reminders that avian survivors of the Cretaceous still carried the legacy of their reptilian kin. The oceans reflected similar transformations. While many benthic foraminifera had been decimated by acidification, plankton communities recovered in other forms, laying the groundwork for modern marine ecosystems. Fish populations shifted, some migrating toward cooler waters, others adapting to new prey. Sharks thrived, their diversity increasing as they exploited niches vacated by extinct competitors. Along coastlines, small semi-aquatic mammals began venturing into water more frequently, their skeletons showing adaptations for swimming and diving. These were the faint beginnings of a monumental shift, the first steps on the evolutionary path that would lead to whales. The PET, in its upheaval, was forcing life not only to endure but to innovate. The landscapes of this time were extraordinary. Imagine the Arctic not as an icy wasteland, but as a swamp forest, buzzing with insects and echoing with the calls of birds. Crocodiles and turtles basked in northern rivers under months of summer light, while dense forests thrived in near darkness during the long winters. High latitudes became havens of diversity, their warmth and rainfall creating ecosystems that today seem impossible. This global redistribution of life demonstrated the adaptability of species, but also underscored the fragility of ecosystems under rapid climate change. Plants flourished under the heat, but not all species thrived equally. Some tropical trees and shrubs spread far beyond their former ranges, their seeds carried by birds and rivers into new territories. Others could not withstand the intense warmth and humidity, retreating or vanishing entirely. Pollen records from sediments show dramatic shifts in plant communities, with tropical species appearing in regions where temperate plants had once grown. Forests became denser, layered, and more complex, creating new opportunities for arboreal mammals and birds. But with this density came vulnerability. Fires sparked by lightning storms swept through parched forests during dry intervals, reducing vast areas to ash before regrowth could begin. The cycle of destruction and renewal became the heartbeat of these ecosystems. One of the most fascinating aspects of the pattern was the impact on mammalian size. The dwarfing phenomenon was not universal, but it was widespread. Early horses, for example, shrank dramatically, their fossilized bones showing individuals no larger than small dogs. Scientists debate the precise causes, but the heat itself seems to have played a role, favouring smaller bodies better suited to dissipating warmth. Scarcity of food, caused by shifts in plant communities, may have compounded the effect, rewarding animals that required less energy to survive. This shrinking was temporary. Once the PETM ended, many lineages regained their larger sizes, but it remains one of the clearest examples of climate-driven evolution preserved in stone. The PETM also altered soils and sediments. Heavy rains leached nutrients from the ground, leaving behind clays rich in iron and aluminum. Floodplains became layered with red and orange deposits, recording the passage of carbon-rich waters. Rivers shifted courses frequently, their channels swollen by intense rainfall. In lowlands, swamps and peat bogs accumulated thick layers of organic matter, some of which would eventually become coal. The earth itself seemed to sweat, its skin marked by the stains of fever. For primates, this period was especially significant. Their rapid diversification during the PETM suggests that they exploited the abundance of fruits in tropical forests. Their ability to adapt to canopy life, coupled with grasping hands and stereoscopic vision, gave them an edge in navigating these complex environments. The earliest members of groups that would later give rise to monkeys, apes, and humans likely took their first evolutionary steps during this climatic upheaval. In the humid forests of the PETM, the story of our own distant ancestry was quietly unfolding. The PETM eventually passed, though not suddenly. Over hundreds of thousands of years, carbon levels gradually declined, temperatures cooled, and ecosystems stabilized. But the world that emerged after was not the same as the one that had entered. Mammals were more diverse, plants more widespread, oceans on the cusp of hosting new giants. The fever had reshaped the biosphere, accelerating trends already underway and carving new possibilities from crisis. And yet, the memory of this event was etched into every surviving lineage. It proved that life could endure even extreme, rapid climate change, but it also revealed the costs, extinctions, shifts in size and form, and ecosystems forever altered. For the survivors, the PETM was both a trial and a turning point, a reminder that stability is temporary and that resilience must be earned in each generation. As the earth exhaled from its fever, forests still steamed with humidity, seas still pressed against coasts, and mammals still scurried and leapt through shadows. But a question remained suspended in the warm air. What new forms would emerge from this crucible, and how would they shape the destiny of the Eocene world to come? When the fever of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum finally began to subside, the Earth was left altered, but not broken. Temperatures gradually cooled, carbon levels in the atmosphere slowly diminished, and ecosystems battered by rapid change began to stabilize. Yet what emerged was not a return to the world before the PETM, but something altogether new. A planet prepared for the Eocene, an epoch that would witness one of the most profound radiations of mammals and birds in history. The chaos of the PETM had pruned, reshaped, and accelerated evolution, leaving behind a biosphere both more fragile and more inventive. Forests that had spread into polar latitudes during the peak of the warming receded somewhat as climate stabilized, but they did not vanish. Instead, they became more stratified and complex. Tropical and subtropical forests dominated vast stretches of the globe, filled with flowering plants whose diversity had exploded during the heatwave. These forests teemed with life. Fruit-bearing trees, vines, and dense undergrowth provided resources for primates, rodents, and ungulates, while insects thrived in staggering numbers. The close ties between plants and pollinators deepened, creating ecosystems that were intricately interwoven and dependent on mutual survival. The evolutionary momentum of these forests was unstoppable, their green sprawl a visible testament to the resilience of life. For mammals, the Petim had been both crucible and opportunity. Many lineages that first appear in the fossil record at this time would become familiar fixtures of later epochs. Early horses, though tiny compared to their descendants, had spread widely across continents, their hooved feet and grinding teeth adapted for browsing soft leaves and shoots. Primates, too, expanded their range, dispersing into Asia, Europe, and North America, their grasping hands and stereoscopic vision well suited to the increasingly complex canopies. Carnivorous mammals diversified as well, giving rise to early forms of hyenodonts and creodonts, formidable predators that tested their dominance in ecosystems now rich with prey. One of the most striking legacies of this period was the increased mobility of species. The PSM had temporarily reshaped geography and climate in ways that facilitated dispersal. Land bridges across northern latitudes allowed animals to migrate between continents, mingling gene pools and accelerating diversification. Fossil sites in Wyoming, for example, show evidence of primates and ungulates that arrived from other continents during this time, their sudden appearance marking the spread of species across what had once been barriers. The Earth was not only healing, it was globalizing, knitting together ecosystems in ways that would shape the course of evolution for millions of years. In the oceans, recovery was slower but equally transformative. Acidification had devastated benthic organisms, but new communities began to take their place. Plankton diversified into forms that more closely resemble those of today, re-establishing the foundation of marine food chains. Fish adapted to new conditions, with lineages of bony fish expanding rapidly. Sharks, always survivors, continued to dominate as apex predators, their teeth littering sediments as enduring fossils of their resilience. Along coastlines, small semi-aquatic mammals adapted further to life in the water, their limbs and spines subtly reshaping to allow swimming. These tentative steps would, in the long arc of time, give rise to whales and dolphins. The Petim, though destructive, had opened evolutionary doors that would lead to the greatest mammals ever to roam the seas. The climate that followed the Petim remained warm by modern standards, but lacked the extreme volatility of the event itself. Seasonal patterns stabilized, rainfall grew more predictable, and ecosystems were able to expand with less interruption. This stability allowed larger mammals to reappear, reversing the dwarfing trend that had characterized the PTM. Early ungulates grew in size, some reaching the stature of small deer. Carnivores expanded in response, sharpening the evolutionary arms race. The Earth was entering an age of scale once again, though not yet the monumental scale of the Mesozoic giants, but the measured growth of mammals carving their place in the world. The landscapes of this time were dynamic and varied. Vast river valleys carried nutrient-rich sediments that nourished floodplain forests. Upland regions hosted diverse plant communities, while coastal plains, now partially drowned by high seas, gave rise to swamps and marshes alive with amphibians and waterfowl. In the high latitudes, forest remained, though less tropical than during the PTM. Dawn redwoods and alders grew in the Arctic, while crocodiles and turtles swam in rivers that cut through near-polar forests. The Earth of the early Eocene was a world where climate and biology coexisted in strange combinations, creating environments unfamiliar to the modern imagination. Primates continued their quiet but significant story. Fossil evidence from Europe and Asia reveals early members of groups that would one day give rise to lemurs, tarsiers, and eventually monkeys and apes. Their small size, agility, and intelligence allowed them to exploit niches in the forest canopy. They were not yet dominant, but their ability to adapt to complex three-dimensional environments gave them a foothold that would prove invaluable in epochs to come. Their presence in the fossil record marks not only survival, but the beginnings of a lineage that would one day stand on two legs and ponder its own origins. Plants too were transformed by the aftermath of the Petit M. The expansion of angiosperms continued, with flowering plants diversifying into new forms that offered fruits, nuts and seeds. These resources fed mammals, birds and insects alike, creating networks of interdependence that made ecosystems more complex and resilient. Grasses, though still minor players in this epoch, began their slow rise, spreading across some landscapes and laying the groundwork for future grassland ecosystems. The interplay between plants and animals became the engine of change, driving co-evolutionary relationships that reshaped both lineages. Geologists and paleontologists today study this time with particular interest, for the Petit and its aftermath offer a rare window into how life responds to rapid climate change. The isotopic signatures in sediments record the sudden spike and slow decline of carbon. Fossils capture the adaptive responses, shrunken body sizes, shifting ranges and sudden dispersals. What emerges from this record is not a story of collapse but of transformation, a reminder that life is not fragile in the sense of breaking easily, but in the sense of being reshaped by every force it encounters. As the Earth settled into the rhythms of the early Eocene, ecosystems carried within them the memory of the Petit. That memory was not written in scars alone, but in innovations. Primates grasping branches in subtropical forests, horses galloping across floodplains, semi-aquatic mammals sliding into coastal waters. The survivors of the Petit had not only endured, they had used crisis as a lever to reinvent themselves. And yet, even as the fever cooled, the planet's restlessness remained. Volcanoes still rumbled, seas continued their slow dance of advance and retreat, and continents drifted further apart. The future would hold its own trials, its own upheavals, and the creatures of the Eocene, no matter how well adapted, would one day face them. For now, though, the Earth was alive with possibility. The silence left by the Chicxulub impact was long gone, replaced by a chorus of mammals, birds and insects filling forests, rivers and seas. But every chorus carries within it pauses, and in those pauses lies the promise of the next great transformation. By the dawn of the Eocene, the Earth had fully stepped into a new age, one that bore little resemblance to the shadowed world that followed the Chicxulub impact. The silence of extinction had been replaced by a chorus of life, and the planet was now alive with mammals, birds and forests that spread across continents in riotous abundance. This was a time of experimentation and expansion, when evolution seemed to accelerate, filling every available niche with novel forms. The echoes of catastrophe still lingered in the fossil record, but on the surface of the planet life had become bold again. The mammals of the early Eocene were the clearest testament to this new vitality. Where the Paleocene had been defined by small, cautious forms, the Eocene saw the rise of larger, more specialized species. Early horses, still small by modern standards, galloped through floodplains, their hooved feet adapted to the soft ground. Tapir-like creatures rooted in forests, feeding on tender shoots and leaves. Early rhino relatives began to grow bulkier, testing the boundaries of size in ecosystems that could now sustain larger herbivores. Their teeth reveal the gradual shift toward processing tougher vegetation, an adaptation to changing plant life that foreshadowed the spread of grasslands millions of years later. Carnivores evolved in parallel. Haenodonts and creodonts, the formidable predators of the age, developed sharp teeth and powerful jaws capable of tearing flesh. Though not yet as specialized as later carnivores, they filled the ecological role once dominated by raptors and tyrannosaurs, stalking the herbivores that now populated the forests and plains. Their fossilized remains show adaptations for endurance and stealth, evidence of hunters that relied on both strength and patience. Birds, too, played their part as predators. In South America, isolated terror birds grew larger, their strong legs and curved beaks making them apex hunters of their ecosystems. On other continents, raptors and owls honed their skills in the skies, perfecting strategies of ambush and precision. The forests of the Eocene were unlike those of today. With warm climates extending into polar regions, dense canopies stretched across much of the globe. Tropical and subtropical plants dominated, their flowers and fruits feeding mammals, insects and birds in endless cycles of interaction. Vines and creepers formed tangled understories, while towering trees shaded river valleys. These forests were vibrant but also competitive, forcing animals to adapt to the complexity of layered habitats. Arboreal primates thrived here, their grasping hands and stereoscopic vision perfect for navigating branches. Fossil evidence suggests that early tarsiers and lemur-like primates diversified during this period, their tiny bodies darting through the canopy in search of fruits and insects. These primates were not yet significant in size or influence, but their evolutionary trajectory had been set, and in their adaptations lay the distant roots of humanity. Insects continued their quiet dominance, their diversity exploding alongside the flowering plants they pollinated. Amber from Eocene forest preserves bees, ants and beetles in exquisite detail, their forms remarkably similar to those alive today. These insects not only ensured the reproduction of plants, but also served as critical food sources for birds, reptiles and mammals. The hum of insect life was the heartbeat of the forests, binding together the cycles of pollination, decomposition and predation. Without them, the richness of Eocene ecosystems could not have existed. The oceans mirrored this vitality, though their recovery had been slower. By the Eocene, plankton communities had rebounded, establishing the base of food webs that sustained fish, crustaceans and mollusks. Sharks remained apex predators, their teeth scattered across ancient seabeds as enduring symbols of resilience. But the most extraordinary change was taking place along the coastlines. Small, semi-aquatic mammals were evolving into forms increasingly adapted to marine life, their limbs lengthened into paddles, their bodies streamlined for swimming. These were the ancestors of whales, beginning the monumental transition from land back to the sea. In their tentative dives and forays into deeper waters lay the seeds of future leviathans that would dominate the oceans for tens of millions of years. The climate of the early Eocene was still warm, perhaps the warmest sustained period since the extinction. Polar regions remained forested, home to crocodiles, turtles and mammals unthinkable in today's icy expanses. The Earth was a greenhouse world, yet this warmth fostered diversity rather than collapse. Rainfall was abundant, fueling rivers that carved valleys and floodplains. Swamps and wetlands expanded, hosting amphibians and birds. Coastal regions teemed with life, their estuaries serving as nurseries for fish and mammals alike. To stand in an Eocene landscape would have been to witness an Earth bursting with vitality, a world in which the scars of the past seemed buried beneath layers of green abundance. Yet even in this thriving world, signs of future challenges were already emerging. The expansion of forests and the spread of mammals created new pressures. Predators and prey locked into evolutionary arms races, each adaptation in one sparking counter-adaptations in the other. Climate, though stable compared to the PETM, still fluctuated in pulses, testing the resilience of species. Sea level shifted, drowning some habitats while creating new ones. The Eocene was not a static paradise, but a dynamic theatre where change was constant and survival was never guaranteed. The fossil record captures this dynamism in vivid detail. In the Messel Pit of Germany, one of the most remarkable Eocene fossil sites, entire ecosystems are preserved in layers of oil shale. Delicate feathers of birds, scales of fish, and even stomach contents of mammals have been found, offering intimate glimpses into the lives of creatures that thrived in this epoch. From such sites, paleontologists reconstruct not only species but entire communities, revealing the intricacy of relationships that bound them together. Each fossil is both an artifact of survival and a reminder of the fragility of existence. For primates, the Eocene was a pivotal chapter. Their diversification during this time laid the groundwork for later evolutionary leaps. They explored not only the canopy but also new behaviours, social bonds, communication and problem-solving, that would in time become hallmarks of the lineage. Though they remained small and largely inconspicuous, their adaptations carried the spark of potential that would one day reshape the planet more profoundly than any asteroid or volcano. Plants, too, were preparing for transformations yet to come. Grasses, still minor players in Eocene landscapes, began to spread quietly across some regions. Their presence was subtle but significant, setting the stage for the great grassland expansions of the Oligocene and Miocene. In the Eocene forests, grasses were overshadowed by trees and shrubs, but their ability to colonize disturbed ground hinted at a future when they would dominate vast ecosystems. Evolution was already sketching outlines of worlds that would only emerge millions of years later. The Earth of the Eocene was vibrant, diverse, and full of promise. It was a world no longer haunted directly by the Chicxulub impact, but instead shaped by its aftermath, by the resilience and innovation that catastrophe had forced into being. The mammals, birds, insects, and plants of this epoch carried within them the memory of survival and the momentum of adaptation. They were architects of a new world, building futures from the ruins of the past, and yet, beneath the warmth and abundance, the Earth remained restless. The continents continued their slow drift, volcanoes rumbled and oceans deepened. The stability of the Eocene was real, but not eternal. It was only a chapter in a longer story, a reminder that life, no matter how vibrant, is always poised at the edge of the next transformation. By the middle of the Eocene, the world was teeming with life in forms both familiar and alien. The Earth's warmth had reached a sustained peak, and ecosystems thrived in climates unlike anything known today. Forests blanketed continents, and even polar regions were shrouded in dense vegetation, with crocodiles basking in northern rivers and broadleaf trees shading landscapes that now lie under ice. The planet, though reshaped by catastrophe only a few million years earlier, pulsed with abundance, and evolution was crafting its masterpieces in both quiet subtleties and bold experiments. The mammals of this era had grown bolder in scale and specialization. Where the Paleocene had been dominated by small and cautious creatures, the Middle Eocene saw the emergence of true giants. Brontotheres, massive herbivores distantly related to horses and rhinoceroses, roamed floodplains, their enormous bodies sustained by lush vegetation. With their forked horns and hulking frames, they stood as symbols of the mammalian ambition to reclaim ecological dominance. Alongside them grazed early relatives of tapirs and rhinos, creatures adapted to browsing on soft shoots and shrubs in the shade of forests. Their increasing size was possible only because ecosystems had stabilized enough to support large-bodied herbivores once again. Predators responded to this rise in size with equal ambition. Hyenodonts and creodonts sharpened their place in food webs, growing larger and more powerful. Fossils reveal skulls with elongated jaws, filled with sharp teeth, adaptations for seizing and tearing flesh. These carnivores were not yet the cats or wolves of later epochs, but they embodied the same principle, a relentless pursuit of prey in ecosystems now rich with herbivores. Birds, too, staked their claim as hunters. In South America, terror birds grew larger, their legs built for pursuit, and their beaks honed for delivering crushing blows. They filled niches abandoned by non-avian dinosaurs, reminders that the evolutionary legacy of predation did not vanish with the Cretaceous. In the forests, primates continued their quiet rise. Fossil sites across Europe, Asia, and North America reveal the presence of early lemur-like and tarsier-like primates, creatures with grasping hands, stereoscopic vision, and agile bodies designed for canopy life. They were small but versatile, feeding on fruits, insects, and leaves, thriving in the layered complexity of Eocene forests. Their diversity at this time suggests that they were not merely survivors but active participants in shaping ecosystems, dispersing seeds as they fed, linking plant and animal communities in new ways. The foundations of primate evolution, which would one day give rise to humans, were being laid in these hidden canopies. The oceans of the Eocene were no less extraordinary. Plankton communities had fully recovered, fueling food webs that supported schools of fish, cephalopods, and sharks. Coral reefs, still fragile, began to flourish again in some regions, creating vibrant habitats that pulsed with biodiversity. Sharks remained apex predators, their teeth scattered across sediments in staggering numbers. Yet the most dramatic transformation was underway among mammals. The semi-aquatic ancestors of whales, once tentative waders in coastal waters, now began to spend most of their lives at sea. Fossils such as Ambulocetus, a crocodile-like creature capable of walking on land and swimming in rivers, capture this transition. By the late Eocene, fully aquatic whales like Basilosaurus appeared, elongated serpentine giants that ruled the oceans as decisively as marine reptiles once had. The return of mammals to the sea was one of evolution's boldest moves, reshaping marine ecosystems forever. Climate during the Middle Eocene remained warm, though subtle shifts began to appear. Polar regions, while still lush with forests, experienced seasonal extremes of light that tested their inhabitants. Crocodiles and turtles endured long periods of twilight in winter, surviving on stored energy, while mammals adapted to seasonal rhythms of fruiting and flowering plants. Rainfall patterns fluctuated, creating cycles of flood and drought that forced animals to migrate or adapt. The stability of the Eocene was real, but it was not absolute. Beneath its green abundance lay signs of future change. Geologically, the Earth was in motion. Continents drifted further into their modern positions, altering ocean currents and wind patterns. The collision of India with Asia had begun to raise the Himalayas, reshaping regional climates and creating new habitats. In the southern hemisphere, South America remained isolated, its fauna evolving in splendid seclusion. Strange ungulates with features found nowhere else grazed in forests and plains, while terror birds grew into apex predators. This isolation turned South America into a crucible of evolutionary experimentation, producing creatures that would later puzzle paleontologists with their unique forms. The fossil record from this time offers hauntingly detailed glimpses into Eocene life. The Messel Pit in Germany, a site of exceptional preservation, holds the remains of entire ecosystems, from fish and insects to birds and mammals. Fossils from this site reveal bats already capable of flight, leaves with insect damage showing ancient herbivory, and even the stomach contents of animals, preserved as if the moment of death were frozen in time. From such windows into the past, scientists reconstruct not only the forms of creatures, but their behaviours, diets, and ecological roles. The Eocene emerges not as an abstract age, but as a living, breathing world captured in stone. Plants too shaped this world with silent determination. Flowering plants dominated, producing fruits and seeds that fed both arboreal and terrestrial animals. Pollinators ensured their reproduction, and in return plants offered nectar, pollen, and food. The spread of grasses was still in its early stages, but their quiet expansion hinted at a future when open grasslands would transform entire continents. For now, forests ruled, their dense canopies filtering sunlight, their roots stabilizing soils, and their fallen leaves feeding insects and fungi that recycled nutrients into the ecosystem. The Middle Eocene was not a paradise untouched by hardship. Volcanic eruptions occasionally disrupted climates, filling skies with ash and cooling regions temporarily. Shifts in ocean currents altered rainfall, leaving some areas parched and others drenched. Ecosystems responded in cycles of collapse and recovery, their resilience tested repeatedly. Yet these disturbances, far from halting evolution, accelerated it. favouring species that could adapt quickly and innovate in the face of change. The richness of Eocene life was born not from stability alone, but from the interplay of abundance and disruption. The mammals, birds, and plants of this epoch carried within them the legacy of the Chicxulub impact, though its direct scars were now millions of years past. The catastrophe had cleared the stage, and the Eocene actors had filled it with drama, diversity, and daring. The Earth no longer bore the silence of extinction, but the noise of flourishing life, a reminder that recovery is not merely a return to what was lost, but a transformation into something entirely new. And yet, as vast herds grazed, as primates leapt through canopies, as whales slid deeper into oceans, the Earth's systems were already shifting again. Subtle drops in temperature and changes in carbon cycles hinted at a new direction, one that would eventually lead to ice creeping into polar regions and grasslands spreading across continents. The Eocene was not the final destination of recovery. It was a prelude, a chapter in the restless story of a planet forever in flux. As the Eocene world matured, its vibrant ecosystems reflected both the triumph of recovery and the inevitability of change. The Earth was no longer haunted by the silence of the Chicxulub aftermath, nor was it caught in the fever of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Instead, it stood in a state of lush equilibrium, its continents cloaked in forests and its oceans teeming with new giants. Yet this equilibrium was deceptive, for beneath its surface lay the subtle stirrings of transition, a planet quietly recalibrating toward climates and landscapes very different from those that had allowed this flourishing. The mammals of the later Eocene revealed how far evolution had come since the extinction. Brontotheras, with their immense bodies and paired nasal horns, roamed in herds across floodplains, their bulk challenging the vegetation that sustained them. These towering herbivores were symbols of the mammalian rise to grandeur, proof that ecosystems could now support creatures approaching the size of the dinosaurs that had once dominated the Earth. Alongside them grazed early perissodactyls, ancestors of horses and tapirs, while artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates that would one day include deer, pigs, and camels, were expanding into new forms. Their jaws and teeth grew increasingly specialized, marking an evolutionary trajectory that would eventually transform landscapes into open grasslands. Carnivores adapted in lockstep. Creodonts, the dominant predators of the time, hunted with elongated jaws and sharp teeth designed for slicing through flesh. Some grew to formidable sizes, able to bring down large herbivores, while others remained smaller, preying on mammals, reptiles, and birds. Their dominance was not permanent, but in this age they reigned supreme. Birds also continued their evolutionary experiments in predation. In South America, terror birds expanded in size and ferocity, their long legs enabling swift pursuit and their hooked beaks delivering devastating strikes. These avian predators, descendants of theropod dinosaurs, were vivid reminders that the legacy of the Mesozoic still lingered in the beating heart of the Eocene. Primates, though small compared to the giants of the plains, were weaving a different kind of legacy. In the canopies of Asia, Africa, and Europe, they diversified into prosimians and early anthropoids, their bodies adapting to a life of leaping, grasping, and navigating complex three-dimensional spaces. Their forward-facing eyes gave them depth perception, and their dexterous hands allowed delicate manipulation of fruits and insects. Fossil evidence from the Fayum Depression in Egypt reveals a dazzling array of early primates, some with traits foreshadowing monkeys and apes. Though they were still a minor presence in global ecosystems, their evolutionary trajectory was undeniable. Intelligence, flexibility, and social complexity would become their greatest strengths. The oceans of the later Eocene presented an equally dramatic story. The lineage of whales, once tentative coastal waders, had by now produced fully aquatic giants. Basilosaurus, with its elongated serpentine body, swam through warm seas as one of the first apex predators among marine mammals. Unlike modern whales, It retained small hind limbs, vestiges of its terrestrial ancestry, but its powerful body was wholly adapted to swimming. Alongside it swam early forms of smaller whales that fed on fish and plankton, laying the groundwork for the eventual split between toothed and baleen whales. In just a few million years, mammals had claimed the oceans as their own, succeeding where marine reptiles had perished. Marine ecosystems, however, remained sensitive. Coral reefs had begun to expand again, but their recovery was still incomplete. Their growth slowed by shifts in temperature and acidity. Sharks continued their ancient dominance, adapting quickly to changes in prey populations. Mollusks, cephalopods, and crustaceans filled coastal zones, supporting birds, fish, and mammals. The oceans, once emptied by extinction and acidification, had regained their vitality, though they carried within them the memory of fragility. On land, plants continued their silent revolution. Flowering plants dominated nearly every ecosystem, their fruits and seeds feeding animals from primates to ungulates. Pollinators, bees, beetles, flies, thrived in these partnerships, ensuring the reproduction of plants while providing sustenance for countless species. Grasses, though still confined to small niches, were beginning to spread further, creeping into disturbed landscapes and floodplains. Their ability to grow quickly after fire or drought hinted at the ecological future they would one day shape, the grasslands of the Oligocene and Miocene. For now, forests ruled, but the whisper of open plains had begun. Climate during the later Eocene shifted subtly, signalling the approach of another turning point. Though the epoch was still warm, gradual cooling trends emerged, particularly in high latitudes. Ice began to accumulate in Antarctica, tentative and seasonal at first, but enough to alter global sea levels and ocean currents. These changes were the first signs of a planetary transition that would eventually culminate in the glaciations of the Oligocene. The Earth was restless, as always, its cycles of warmth and cold shaping the destiny of life. The fossil record captures this transition vividly. Sediment layers show isotopic evidence of cooling, while plant fossils reveal shifts in vegetation patterns. Species that had thrived in lush tropical forests began to retreat as climates dried and cooled. Some lineages adapted, while others vanished. Brontotheras, despite their grandeur, would soon disappear, their specialized diets and massive size leaving them vulnerable to change. Creodonts too would falter, unable to compete with the rising wave of true carnivores that would dominate the next epoch. Evolution, indifferent but relentless, continued its quiet pruning. Yet the later Eocene was not a time of decline. It was a time of experimentation at its fullest. Mammals explored the extremes of size, from tiny insectivores scurrying through the undergrowth to massive herbivores shaping entire ecosystems. Birds diversified into forms both delicate and fearsome. Primates expanded their reach, testing the boundaries of intelligence and adaptability. Whales claimed the oceans, reinventing what it meant to be a marine giant. Plants and insects deepened their symbiotic bonds, weaving ecosystems of extraordinary resilience. This was not merely recovery. It was a reimagining of what life on Earth could be. To stand in an Eocene forest would have been to hear a world alive with sound, the calls of primates echoing through the canopy, the buzzing of insects in shafts of sunlight, the rumble of large herbivores moving through undergrowth. To walk along its coasts would have been to witness whales breaching in the distance, seabirds diving into waters, and sharks patrolling beneath the surface. The Earth, though shaped by catastrophe, had become a place of splendour and innovation, its creatures carrying both the scars and the gifts of survival. And yet, the question lingered like a shadow behind the abundance. What would happen when the warmth receded, when forests gave way to grass, when the giants that now thrived faced the test of a cooling world? The answers waited in the coming Oligocene, where resilience would once again be tested, and the patterns of life would shift into forms both strange and familiar. As the Eocene approached its twilight, the Earth began to lean away from the greenhouse conditions that had defined its early and middle chapters. Subtle shifts in temperature and atmosphere, imperceptible on a human scale but profound across millennia, nudged the planet toward a cooler climate. The great forests that had cloaked the poles began to thin, and the warmth that had once allowed crocodiles to bask in Arctic rivers began to fade. These were the first signs of a new age, the Oligocene, that would soon sweep across the globe, redrawing landscapes and rewriting the rules of survival once again. For the creatures of the late Eocene, the world still appeared lush and abundant. Herds of brontotheres still moved across floodplains, their massive horns silhouetted against the sky, though their days were numbered. Early rhinoceroses and tapirs browsed in forests, shaping vegetation with their appetites. Small horse ancestors grazed on soft shoots, their hooves carrying them swiftly through open patches of woodland. Artiodactyls, early relatives of camels, pigs and deer, were expanding rapidly, their adaptability giving them an edge in changing climates. The Earth was still filled with giants, but the balance was shifting. An evolutionary opportunity favoured the versatile over the specialised. Predators continued to rule in their respective realms, but their dominance was not secure. Creodonts, once fearsome hunters, were beginning to falter. Fossil evidence shows their diversity declining, their ecological roles increasingly challenged by the emergence of true carnivorans, the ancestors of modern cats, dogs and bears. These newcomers, smaller but more adaptable, carried traits that would eventually eclipse the creodonts: greater agility, sharper senses, and more efficient dentition for processing flesh. The evolutionary torch was being passed, not in a dramatic clash, but in the slow, relentless erosion of advantage. Birds added their own layer of dynamism to this fading epoch. In South America, terror birds still stalked their prey, ruling ecosystems in isolation. But elsewhere, waterfowl, raptors, and early songbirds expanded into niches shaped by the spread of flowering plants and insects. Their presence, diverse and adaptable, revealed that avian evolution was accelerating alongside mammalian. Where pterosaurs had once dominated the skies, birds now filled every imaginable role, from insect hunters to apex predators, from scavengers to seed dispersers. The legacy of flight was being rewritten in feather and bone. The oceans told a more dramatic story of change. Whales, only recently transformed from land-dwelling mammals into masters of the seas, now diversified explosively. Basilosaurus, serpentine and predatory, still haunted the waters, but alongside it swam smaller forms experimenting with new feeding strategies. Some began to develop specialized teeth for hunting fish and squid, while others laid the groundwork for the emergence of baleen whales that would one day filter plankton from the seas. These adaptations hinted at a future where whales would split into two grand lineages: toothed hunters and baleen grazers. The oceans of the Eocene, once dominated by sharks, were becoming mammalian kingdoms, a transformation as profound as any on land. Marine ecosystems, however, remained vulnerable to environmental shifts. As the Earth cooled, ocean currents began to reorganize, altering nutrient cycles and reshaping food webs. Coral reefs, fragile as ever, struggled against fluctuations in acidity and temperature. Yet in the vast expanse of open water, plankton continued their quiet dominance, feeding fish, supporting whales, and driving the cycles of oxygen and carbon that bound together atmosphere and ocean. In their microscopic persistence lay the endurance of entire ecosystems. The climate itself was in transition. Isotopic records from marine sediments show a steady decline in global temperatures toward the close of the Eocene. Antarctica, once forested and temperate, began to accumulate ice on its highlands. The formation of this ice not only lowered sea levels, but also altered ocean circulation, setting in motion currents that would profoundly influence global climate. The Earth was leaving behind the balmy uniformity of the Eocene and heading toward a world of sharper contrast between warm and cold. For plants, this shift brought both loss and opportunity. Dense tropical forests began to retract toward equatorial regions, while temperate forests spread further north and south. Grasses, still relatively minor players, took advantage of openings in the canopy and disturbances caused by climate change. Their slow but steady expansion hinted at the vast grasslands of later epochs, where herds of grazing mammals would dominate. In the late Eocene, grasses were whispers of the future, their resilience a quiet prelude to the ecosystems they would someday command. Among the primates, diversity continued, though their ranges shifted with the changing climate. In Africa and Asia, early anthropoids, the precursors of monkeys and apes, were beginning to appear. Their larger brains, forward-facing eyes, and social behaviours mark them as evolutionary pioneers. In Europe and North America, prosimians like lemur-like primates clung to dwindling habitats, their future uncertain as forests thinned. These small primates carried within them the seeds of future dominance, but in the late Eocene they were still vulnerable, dependent on ecosystems already in flux. The fossil record from this time speaks of contrasts. Sites like the Fayum Depression in Egypt capture rich communities of mammals, birds and reptiles, preserved in sediments that record lush tropical conditions. At the same time, evidence from higher latitudes reveals cooling trends and shifting plant communities. This juxtaposition reminds us that the Earth's changes are rarely uniform. While one region may thrive, another may decline, and survival often depends on being in the right place at the right time. The giants of the Eocene, Brontotheras, creodonts and massive whales, were magnificent, but many were ill-suited for the cooler, drier climates to come. Their size, once an advantage, became a burden. Large bodies required abundant vegetation, and specialized diets left little room for adaptation. Evolution favors flexibility, and as the late Eocene tipped toward the Oligocene, it was the adaptable, the opportunistic, and the small that held the keys to the future. The late Eocene was thus a world of splendor and fragility. Forests still teemed with birds and primates, plains still shook beneath the weight of mammalian herds, and oceans still roared with the power of whales and sharks. But beneath this abundance, the climate shifted, ice grew, and ecosystems adjusted with each pulse of change. What had begun with recovery from the Chicxulub impact was now transforming into preparation for a different kind of challenge. Not fire and darkness, but cold and openness, where survival would depend less on hiding in forests and more on mastering the expanses of grass and ice. And so, as the curtain began to fall on the Eocene, the stage was being prepared for the Oligocene, a world of cooling climates, shrinking forests, and the rise of open landscapes. In that new age, the survivors of the Eocene's abundance would be tested again, forced to adapt not to the violence of catastrophe, but to the slow, relentless hand of climate itself. The transition from the Eocene to the Oligocene was not a sudden catastrophe like the Chicxulub impact, but rather a drawn-out transformation that reshaped Earth's surface in ways just as profound. The warmth of the Eocene, with its lush forests at the poles and crocodiles basking in Arctic rivers, gradually gave way to a cooler, drier world. The forest that had stretched unbroken across continents began to retreat, making space for open woodlands and the first true grasslands. The Earth was beginning to breathe in a new rhythm, one that pulsed with cycles of ice, drought, and open skies. This cooling was driven by tectonic change as much as by atmospheric shifts. Antarctica, once a green and temperate continent, became isolated by the opening of the Drake Passage between it and South America. This seaway allowed the birth of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a powerful ocean current that circled the continent and effectively cut it off from warmer waters. With this barrier in place, Antarctica cooled rapidly. Ice sheets spread across its highlands, and glaciers began to march outward. The appearance of permanent ice on Antarctica marked one of the most important climatic shifts since the extinction of the dinosaurs, for it transformed global ocean circulation and set the stage for the modern climate system. For the animals of the late Eocene and early Oligocene, this new climate meant change at every level. Large herbivores that had thrived in lush forests found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Brontotheres, with their enormous size and specialized diets, could not adapt to shrinking forests and the spread of more open habitats. Within a few million years, they vanished, leaving behind only fossils that speak of their grandeur and their vulnerability. Other lineages, however, were more flexible. Early horses, once small browsers, began to adapt to tougher vegetation, their teeth developing higher crowns capable of grinding abrasive grasses. This adaptation marked the beginning of a long evolutionary journey that would eventually make horses the quintessential grazers of the open plains. Artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates, expanded rapidly during this time. Camels, pigs, deer, and their kin evolved traits that allowed them to thrive in open landscapes, feeding on a variety of plants and moving efficiently across vast distances. Their diversity and adaptability gave them an advantage in ecosystems no longer dominated by dense forests. These were the animals that would shape much of the terrestrial world in epochs to come, replacing the more archaic forms of the Eocene. Carnivores too underwent profound change. The decline of creodonts, once the dominant predators, opened ecological space for true carnivorans, ancestors of cats, dogs, bears, and mustelids. Smaller, more agile, and equipped with specialized teeth, they were better suited to pursue prey in open habitats. This shift marked the beginning of modern predator-prey dynamics, where speed, endurance, and strategy became as important as size and brute strength. Fossil evidence from this period reveals carnivores experimenting with forms that foreshadowed the wolves, lions, and leopards of today. The oceans mirrored the transformations of the land. Whales, fully aquatic by the late Eocene, diversified into early forms of toothed and baleen whales. Some hunted fish and squid with sharp teeth, while others began to experiment with bulk feeding, a strategy that would eventually give rise to the giant baleen whales of the Miocene. Basilosaurus, a serpentine predator, still dominated some seas, but its reign was nearing its end, replaced by more efficient forms adapted to modern-style ocean ecosystems. Sharks remained abundant, their teeth scattered in sediments worldwide, but they now shared the seas with mammalian giants whose evolutionary journey was only beginning. Marine ecosystems also reflected the cooling climate. As polar ice expanded, nutrient-rich waters circulated differently, driving plankton blooms that fed fish, whales, and seabirds. Coral reefs, fragile as ever, suffered in some regions but expanded in others, creating patchy mosaics of marine life. The oceans of the Oligocene were less uniform than those of the Eocene, but they were dynamic, shaped by currents that still govern marine ecosystems today. Plants carried their own story of adaptation. Tropical forests retreated toward the equator, while temperate forests expanded across mid-latitudes. The spread of grasses accelerated, filling disturbed soils and open spaces with resilient green carpets. Though grasses remained secondary to forests, their persistence was undeniable, and they were slowly transforming the diets of herbivores and the behaviors of predators. The grasslands of the Oligocene were the first hints of ecosystems that would dominate much of Earth's surface in later epochs. Evolution was preparing the ground for vast plains where herds would thunder and predators would give chase across horizons without trees. The primates of this age felt the pressure of change acutely. In Europe and North America, many prosimian primates declined as forests thinned, unable to adapt to the cooler and more seasonal environments. But in Africa and Asia, early anthropoids continued to thrive. The Fayum Depression in Egypt, a fossil-rich site, preserves extraordinary remains of these primates. Small-bodied creatures with forward-facing eyes, dexterous hands, and traits that foreshadowed the monkeys and apes of later epochs. These anthropoids were the seeds of future diversity, their survival tied closely to the shifting forests of the Old World. From them would eventually emerge the lineage that would one day stand upright and reshape the planet. The fossil record of the Oligocene also captures moments of ecological tension. Bones of large mammals found alongside those of predators reveal sudden deaths in hunts. Layers of sediment filled with plant pollen record the retreat of forests and the rise of grasslands. Shark teeth embedded in whale bones tell of fierce battles in oceans newly filled with mammalian prey. Each fossil is a fragment of a story, a predator chasing its quarry, a plant spreading its seeds, a whale diving into deeper waters. Together they form a mosaic of transition, an Earth reconfiguring itself for a new phase of life. Culturally, we often think of the Eocene as an age of abundance, and the Oligocene as an age of restraint, but this framing misses the deeper truth. The Oligocene was not simply a cooling, it was an opening. It was the epoch when forests no longer dominated every landscape, when grasslands began to shape the evolution of animals, when predators honed their strategies for open pursuit. It was a world preparing itself for the drama of the Miocene, when life would surge into forms both spectacular and strange. The animals that endured this transition carried within them the resilience born of earlier trials. They were heirs not only to the Chicxulub survivors, but also to those who had withstood the fever of the Pepm and the lush competition of the Eocene. Now they faced a new challenge, a world where cold, openness and scarcity would test survival in ways fire and darkness once had. And so, as ice grew across Antarctica and forest retreated, the stage was set for another transformation. The Earth, restless and unyielding, was preparing to hand the mantle of dominance to creatures adapted not to lush abundance, but to the discipline of open ground and shifting seasons. The question was no longer whether life could recover from catastrophe, but how it would thrive in the face of the planet's quiet but inexorable cooling breath. The Oligocene unfolded as a world of contrasts, its landscapes marked by both retreat and innovation. Where the Eocene had been a greenhouse of lush, continuous forests, the Oligocene was defined by openness. The cooling of the Earth restructured environments, forcing life to abandon the security of dense canopies and adapt to windswept plains, expanding grasslands and climates with sharper seasonal rhythms. In this epoch, survival meant not only enduring scarcity, but mastering it, finding balance in ecosystems that were leaner, harsher, and less forgiving than those that came before. The most dramatic shift was the growth of the Antarctic ice sheet. The isolation of Antarctica by the Antarctic circumpolar current sealed its fate as a frozen continent, a transformation that rippled outward across the globe. As glaciers expanded, sea levels fell, exposing new coastlines and altering habitats. Ocean currents reorganized, carrying cold, nutrient-rich waters into new regions. These changes reshaped climates everywhere. Winters grew harsher, summers shorter, and rainfall less predictable. Forests retreated toward equatorial zones, replaced in many places by scrublands, woodlands, and the early mosaics of grass-dominated environments. Mammals responded with astonishing creativity. Herbivores adapted first, their teeth and digestive systems evolving to handle the tougher plants of open landscapes. Horses, once tiny browsers of soft forest foliage, developed higher-crowned teeth suited for grinding abrasive grasses. Their limbs lengthened, their hooves hardened, and their bodies became built for speed. The image of horses galloping across wide plains was born in these evolutionary steps, though the grasslands were not yet vast seas of green. They were patchworks, interspersed with shrubs and woodlands. Artiodactyls, too, expanded, their adaptability allowing them to explore niches from browsers in wooded habitats to grazers on open plains. Early camels and deer-like forms spread widely, proving that flexibility was a ticket to survival. Predators kept pace with their prey. Creodonts, already in decline, were eclipsed by true carnivorans, the ancestors of modern cats, dogs, and bears. These carnivores were leaner, faster, and more efficient, their teeth specialized for slicing meat, their senses keen for stalking in open terrain. The pursuit predator, built for speed and strategy rather than brute ambush, came into its own in the Oligocene. Fossil tracks suggest dynamic chases across floodplains, scenes that foreshadowed the iconic predator-prey duels of later savannas. Birds, too, adapted to the new openness. Raptors took advantage of clear skies and long sight lines, hunting rodents and small mammals that scurried across exposed ground. In South America, terror birds continued their reign, their long strides and curved beaks well suited to dominating prey in open habitats. Primates, however, faced a more precarious path. As forests receded, many primates lost their habitats. In Europe and North America, they declined sharply, unable to adjust to the spreading woodlands and grasslands. Yet in Africa and Asia, anthropoids, the early monkeys and apes, continued to diversify. Fossil discoveries from the Fayum Depression reveal a flourishing array of primates during this time. Some small-bodied insect eaters, others fruit specialists, and still others with traits hinting at the beginnings of larger brains and more complex social lives. Though modest in size and number, these anthropoids represented the persistence of a lineage that would one day transform the world. The oceans told a story of renewal rather than decline. With the cooling of the earth, currents carried nutrients across vast distances, fueling plankton blooms that sustained marine food webs. Whales, now fully aquatic and diverse, adapted rapidly to this bounty. Early toothed whales honed echolocation, a sensory innovation that allowed them to hunt in dark waters with extraordinary precision. Early baleen whales began experimenting with bulk feeding, using protobaleen structures to filter plankton-rich waters. This divergence between toothed and baleen whales marked the dawn of two lineages that would dominate the seas for the rest of the Cenozoic. Sharks continued their eternal role as predators, but now they competed with whales for supremacy, a rivalry that endures in modern oceans. Coastal ecosystems flourished as well. Seals and sea lions had not yet evolved, but shorelines were alive with birds and small mammals exploiting tidal zones. Estuaries became nurseries for fish, while coral reefs, though vulnerable, adapted to new oceanic conditions and grew in scattered brilliance. Marine sediments from this time reveal a complex interplay of species, a reminder that even amid cooling, the oceans remain dynamic laboratories of evolution. Plants continue to adapt silently but decisively. Grasses spread further, their resilience to drought and grazing, allowing them to colonize landscapes where forests had retreated. Their ability to regrow quickly after being eaten or burned by fire made them unmatched in disturbed environments. Fire itself became a defining ecological force in the Oligocene. Lightning storms ignited dry grasslands, clearing old growth and making way for new shoots. Animals learned to live with these cycles. Grazers fed on fresh growth after fires, while predators hunted in the open spaces fires created. The relationship between grass, fire, and grazing animals, one of the most important ecological feedback loops in Earth's history, was beginning to take shape. The fossil record captures these shifts with haunting clarity. In North America, bones of early horses lie alongside those of nimravids, saber-toothed carnivores that stalked them. In Asia, the remains of anthracotheres, hippo-like herbivores, speak of the diversity of ungulates exploring new habitats. In Europe, layers of sediment record the decline of forests and the spread of open woodlands. In South America, fossils reveal a completely separate evolutionary stage, with unique ungulates and terror birds evolving in isolation. The Oligocene was not a uniform world, but a patchwork of regions, each carrying its own evolutionary experiments shaped by local climate, geography, and history. One of the most fascinating consequences of the Oligocene was the sharpening of seasons. Where the Eocene had offered relatively stable warmth, the Oligocene brought contrasts: hot summers, cold winters, wet seasons, and dry ones. These cycles tested the endurance of species. Mammals developed thicker coats, seasonal breeding patterns, and strategies for migration. Plants dropped leaves in dry or cold periods, conserving water and energy. Ecosystems became tuned not just to abundance but to fluctuation, an adaptation that would prepare them for the even harsher climates of later epochs. The Oligocene was a chapter of quiet but powerful transformation. The giants of the Eocene had largely vanished, replaced by leaner, more adaptable forms. Predators grew sharper, prey faster, and plants more resilient. Whales reinvented marine life, while grasses laid the foundation for future grassland worlds. Primates clung to survival in Africa and Asia, preserving the lineage that would eventually rise to dominance. The Earth itself shifted into a climate regime that would echo through the rest of the Cenozoic, with ice as a permanent presence at the poles and open habitat spreading across continents. And yet, this epoch was not an ending, it was a prelude. The ecosystems of the Oligocene were prototypes, testing forms and strategies that would define the Miocene. When grasslands would expand dramatically, mammals would reach new heights of diversity, and primates would take bold evolutionary steps. The Oligocene was a proving ground, a crucible in which resilience was forged not against sudden catastrophe, but against the slow, relentless demands of a cooling planet. As winds swept across open plains, as glaciers spread in the south, as whales sang in reorganized oceans, the Earth carried within it the momentum of change. The silence of extinction was long past, but the planet remained restless, always preparing its next transformation. The question lingered, suspended in the chill of Oligocene winds: how would life, reshaped yet again, step into the unfolding stage of the Miocene? The Miocene dawned as a world of expansion, a stage where the experiments of the Oligocene were tested against vast new landscapes. By this epoch, beginning roughly 23 million years ago, the Earth had settled firmly into its cooler regime, with polar ice a permanent fixture in Antarctica, and climates far less stable than those of the greenhouse Eocene. Forests, once dominant, were now retreating in many regions, replaced by sweeping grasslands that stretched toward the horizon. These new open habitats reshaped evolution, driving animals to adapt in speed, endurance, and efficiency. The Miocene was an age not of lush abundance hidden in canopies, but of openness, where survival played out in the sight of the sun and under the sweep of winds. Herbivores became the architects of this new world. Horses, which had begun their transformation in the Oligocene, flourished across the Miocene plains. Their teeth evolved ever higher crowns, perfectly suited for grinding abrasive grasses rich in silica. Their limbs grew longer, their hooves harder, and their bodies more streamlined, turning them into the quintessential grazers of the open steppe. Fossil sites across North America and Eurasia reveal herds of horses moving across grasslands, their bones preserved as echoes of thunder rolling over ancient plains. Alongside them, camels, antelopes, and early deer spread widely, each exploring niches within these expanding ecosystems. Their presence created moving seas of herbivores, shaping vegetation and fueling the rise of predators. The giants of the Miocene were no less impressive. In Africa and Eurasia, gomphotheres, elephant-like creatures with multiple pairs of tusks, browsed and grazed in woodlands and plains. Some developed long, shovel-shaped lower tusks used to strip bark and dig for roots. Their massive size allowed them to dominate landscapes, altering plant communities through their feeding habits. In the same regions, rhinos reached remarkable diversity, from hornless forms that resembled massive tapirs to the colossal Paraceratherium, one of the largest land mammals ever to walk the earth. Standing over 16 feet at the shoulder, it towered over forests, browsing treetops with a calm that belied its enormity. The Miocene was a stage not only for speed and adaptability, but for grandeur on a scale that rivaled the dinosaurs of old. Predators, in turn, evolved into new forms to meet the challenge of these herds and giants. Early canids, ancestors of wolves, foxes, and dogs, developed pack behaviours, relying on cooperation to bring down prey larger than themselves. Feliform carnivores, early relatives of cats, honed stealth and ambush tactics, their bodies flexible and their claws retractable. Saber-toothed cats emerged during this period, with elongated canines designed for precision killing. Nimravids, the false saber-tooths, stalked the plains and forests with formidable jaws, while true saber-toothed felids would later take their place. The evolutionary arms race between predator and prey reached new heights, each adaptation countered by another, each strategy met with an answer forged in survival. The oceans mirrored this energy of diversification. Whales, now fully adapted to marine life, split into the two great lineages of modern seas. Toothed whales developed advanced echolocation, enabling them to hunt in dark waters with uncanny precision. Orca-like predators patrolled the seas, preying on fish and other marine mammals. Baleen whales, on the other hand, grew larger, perfecting bulk feeding by filtering plankton blooms through fringed plates. Their rise coincided with shifts in ocean currents that fueled massive upwellings of nutrients. Fossil remains of giant baleen whales show that the seeds of today's leviathans were planted in Miocene waters, when the oceans became arenas of both abundance and predation. Marine predators, however, were not limited to whales. Sharks reached some of their greatest diversity in this epoch, with the infamous Carcharicles megalodon rising to dominance later in the Miocene. With teeth the size of human hands and bodies stretching over 50 feet, these sharks were the true titans of the seas, rivaling even the great whales in scale. The rivalry between whales and sharks became one of the defining dramas of the Miocene oceans, a clash of evolutionary giants that shaped the food webs of the deep. On land, plants continued their silent revolution. Grasslands spread across continents, creating vast ecosystems unlike anything the Earth had seen before. These landscapes were shaped by fire as much as by rain. Dry seasons sparked lightning-driven wildfires that cleared old growth, making way for new shoots. Grazers adapted to this cycle, following the green flush that came after fires, while predators learned to patrol the margins of burned fields. Trees adapted too, retreating to riparian corridors along rivers or developing thicker bark to withstand flames. The expansion of grasses also altered atmospheric chemistry, pulling carbon from the air and influencing global climates. Evolution was no longer only about animals, it was about the ecosystems they created together with plants and the planet itself. Primates navigated these changes with remarkable resilience. In Africa, apes diversified, taking advantage of forested refuges where trees still flourished. Fossils from this time reveal apes with traits foreshadowing gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. Flexible shoulders for brachiation, enlarged brains, and complex teeth for varied diets. Their adaptability to both fruits and leaves allowed them to persist even as forests shrank. Monkeys spread widely, diversifying into Old World and New World lineages. In South America, isolated since the Cretaceous, platyrrhines, New World monkeys, evolved independently, swinging through forests with prehensile tails, an innovation absent in their Old World cousins. The Miocene was thus a golden age for primates, setting the stage for the eventual rise of hominins millions of years later. South America, Africa, and Asia each hosted their own evolutionary laboratories. In South America, still cut off from North America, unique mammals flourished. Notungulates and litopterns, strange hoofed creatures unrelated to those elsewhere, grazed and browsed in isolation. Terror birds maintained their dominance as apex predators, filling roles played by big cats and wolves on other continents. In Africa and Eurasia, faunas mingled as land bridges allowed migrations, creating a dynamic interplay of species. This mixing of biotas, combined with climatic pressures, drove waves of innovation and extinction. The Miocene climate was not uniformly kind. While it began warm, the epoch saw gradual cooling, with ice sheets expanding further in Antarctica. This cooling created sharper climatic zones. Deserts expanded, monsoons intensified, and temperate regions experienced more pronounced seasons. Life adapted to these contrasts. Migratory behaviours in birds and mammals became more pronounced as species followed seasonal rains and shifting plant growth. Evolution increasingly rewarded mobility and adaptability to cycles of scarcity and abundance. Fossil records from Miocene deposits paint vivid portraits of these worlds. Skeletons of Paraceratherium tower over layers filled with horse teeth, while predator bones reveal battles etched into tooth marks and broken ribs. Whale fossils found with shark bite marks speak of fierce encounters in ancient seas. Pollen records trace the march of grasses, while volcanic ash layers capture moments when landscapes were abruptly altered by eruptions. Each fragment reveals not only life's resilience, but its ceaseless entanglement with the shifting earth. The Miocene was not merely a continuation of recovery from the Chicxulub impact. It was a chapter of reinvention, where ecosystems took forms unlike those that had ever existed before. The dominance of forests was replaced by grasslands, the supremacy of creodonts by carnivorans, the silence of vanished reptiles by the trumpeting of mammalian herds and the songs of whales. The Earth had moved beyond survival. It was now experimenting with new balances of energy, new architectures of ecosystems, and new expressions of life's potential. And yet, as the Miocene drew on, the planet continued its cooling drift. The stage was being set for even more profound changes in the Pliocene and Pleistocene, when ice would advance and retreat in cycles, and when the lineage of primates would take its most audacious step. But for now, the Miocene stood as a world of abundance and transformation, a vivid testament to how Earth, even after unimaginable destruction, could not only recover, but reinvent itself into something entirely new. The Miocene, with its sprawling grasslands and roaming herds, eventually yielded to another stage in Earth's story, the Pliocene, beginning around 5 million years ago. This epoch carried forward the momentum of innovation, but wrapped it in a tighter weave of contrasts. The world was no longer the lush greenhouse of the Eocene, nor the first cool openness of the Oligocene, but a place oscillating between warmth and chill, wetness and drought. It was during the Pliocene that the outlines of the modern world sharpened, both in geography and in life itself. Continents moved closer to their present positions, climates grew more variable, and animals, and increasingly early humans, began to shape destinies that still echo today. The geography of the Pliocene was decisive. The collision of tectonic plates lifted mountain ranges higher, reshaping weather patterns across continents. The Himalayas grew ever more imposing, intensifying the Asian monsoons. In the Americas, the Isthmus of Panama began to rise, connecting North and South America and severing the Atlantic from the Pacific. This event, one of the most critical in Earth's recent history, rerouted ocean currents and altered climates globally. The Gulf Stream strengthened, bringing warm waters northward and contributing to the cooling and glaciations that would define later epochs. In these geological rearrangements lay the seeds of the ice ages to come. On land, ecosystems bore the marks of both abundance and challenge. Grasslands expanded further, covering vast areas in Africa, Eurasia, and North America. Savannas became the stage upon which herbivores and predators played their ancient dramas. Horses, antelopes, and camels raced across these open spaces, their bodies streamlined for endurance. Elephants and their kin, descended from Miocene gomphotheres, grew into the powerful tusked giants of the Pliocene, shaping vegetation with their feeding and migrations. Some carried spiral tusks, others broad shovel-like jaws, each form an experiment in how best to thrive in shifting landscapes. Predators adapted in parallel. Saber-toothed cats, with their elongated canines, reached their zenith during the Pliocene. These specialized hunters thrived by targeting the large herbivores that roamed the plains. Their power lay not in pursuit, but in ambush, leaping from cover to deliver killing blows with precision. Alongside them, the ancestors of modern lions, leopards and cheetahs spread across Africa and Eurasia, each perfecting different hunting strategies. In North America, dire wolves and nimble canids evolved into pack hunters, honing cooperation as a tool of survival. Birds of prey circled high above, their eyes adapted to spotting movement across the open ground. The predator-prey arms race, forged in the Miocene, reached new levels of complexity and specialization in the Pliocene. The oceans carried their own revolutions. With the closure of the Isthmus of Panama, currents strengthened, fueling nutrient-rich upwellings that transformed marine ecosystems. Fish populations surged, supporting thriving communities of seals, sea lions, and penguins. Whales continued their evolutionary expansion, with baleen whales growing to enormous sizes as they exploited plankton blooms in polar waters. Toothed whales perfected echolocation, hunting squid in deep oceans with extraordinary efficiency. Sharks, though still powerful, now face stiff competition from marine mammals. The great Carcharicles megalodon, once ruler of the seas, began to decline, perhaps pressured by competition from large whales and changing ocean dynamics. By the close of the Pliocene, this giant would vanish, leaving behind only its fossilized teeth as monuments to its supremacy. Climate in the Pliocene oscillated between warmth and cooling, a prelude to the glaciations of the Pleistocene. Early in the epoch, global temperatures were warmer than today, but cooling trends became increasingly pronounced. Ice sheets expanded in Greenland and Antarctica, lowering sea levels and exposing land bridges. These shifts opened migration routes for animals, and eventually humans. Africa's landscapes grew drier and more open, pushing primates out of shrinking forests and onto the savannas. It was here, in these shifting African environments, that the ancestors of humanity began to walk upright. The story of hominins emerged tentatively in the late Miocene, but took clearer shape in the Pliocene. Fossils of Australopithecus, small-bodied primates with both ape-like and human-like traits, reveal creatures capable of walking on two legs while still climbing trees. Their pelvises, feet, and spines carried the marks of bipedalism, an adaptation perhaps born of necessity on the open savanna. Standing upright allowed them to see over grasses, carry food, and travel more efficiently under the hot sun. Their hands remained adept for climbing and grasping, bridging a world of trees and plains. The Pliocene was thus the dawn of humanity's lineage, a quiet but profound shift that would alter Earth's story forever. Other primates also thrived in this epoch. In Africa and Asia, monkeys and apes diversified, exploiting both forests and open woodlands. Old World monkeys expanded rapidly, their diets of leaves and fruits giving them flexibility and varied habitats. In South America, New World monkeys continued their isolated evolution, swinging through forests with prehensile tails. The success of monkeys contrasted with the relative rarity of apes, whose numbers dwindled as forests shrank. Yet from these surviving apes, the roots of modern chimpanzees, gorillas, and eventually humans would endure. Plant life mirrored the new rhythms of the earth. Grasses dominated, their partnership with fire and grazing animals driving cycles of disturbance and renewal. Trees adapted to drier climates by growing thicker bark and deeper roots, or by retreating into river valleys and refuges. Pollen records show the spread of grasses into regions once dominated by woodland, marking a decisive ecological shift. The savanna was no longer a fringe habitat. It was a vast biome, shaping animals and primates alike into forms suited for openness and resilience. The fossil record of the Pliocene is one of both familiarity and strangeness. Sites in East Africa preserve the bones of early hominins, alongside those of elephants, hippos, and antelopes, revealing ecosystems that feel both ancient and recognizable. In North America, prairies were filled with bison-like ancestors, while saber-toothed cats prowled their edges. In Europe, mammoths began their rise, adapted to colder climates with thick fur and curved tusks. The world was, in many ways, beginning to resemble the one humans would inherit. But it was still wilder, rawer, and filled with creatures no longer with us. The Pliocene was also an age of migrations. With continents near their present positions, land bridges allowed animals to cross into new worlds. The Great American Biotic Interchange, triggered by the rise of the Isthmus of Panama, sent North American animals like horses, camels, and saber-toothed cats into South America, while armadillos, sloths, and terror birds travelled north. The collision of these faunas reshaped entire ecosystems, sparking extinctions and adaptations in equal measure. These migrations were a preview of what would come when humans later spread across the globe, blending lineages that had once evolved in isolation. The Pliocene was a prelude, but also a crucible. It set the stage for the Pleistocene ice ages, for the dominance of grasslands, for the spread of elephants and horses and predators adapted to openness. Most of all, it set the stage for humanity. The first upright walkers on the African savanna were not yet builders of fire or makers of tools, but their very posture marked a turning point as decisive as any asteroid strike or volcanic eruption. They were small, vulnerable, and insignificant compared to the giants around them, yet within their bones lay the promise of a species that would eventually reshape the Earth itself. As the Pliocene drew to a close, glaciers thickened, seas retreated, and winds swept across drying plains. Herds still thundered, predators still prowled, and forests still clung to valleys and mountainsides. But the Earth's breath was cold now, carrying with it the whisper of ice. It was a whisper that would soon swell into the roar of the Pleistocene, when the rhythms of glaciation would define life, and when early humans would rise from obscurity to become the planet's most audacious survivors. The Pleistocene arrived not as a single transformation, but as a relentless rhythm, a cycle of ice advancing and retreating that reshaped every continent. Beginning around 2.6 million years ago, it was an epoch marked by glaciation so immense that vast sheets of ice stretched across North America, Europe, and Asia, burying entire landscapes beneath miles of frozen weight. These icy expansions were punctuated by interglacials, brief, warmer intervals when forests returned, rivers flowed freely, and grasslands surged with life. To live in the Pleistocene was to live on the edge of constant change, where no environment stayed the same for long, and survival hinged on adaptability to extremes. The animals of this age became icons of resilience and scale. Mammoths roamed in massive herds across Eurasia and North America, their shaggy coats and curved tusks perfectly suited for life on frozen plains. Some species grew smaller in isolated regions, such as the dwarf mammoths of islands, while others became colossal, their sheer bulk a defense against cold. Mastodons, their close relatives, browsed forests with straighter tusks and diets of leaves and branches. Woolly rhinoceroses scraped snow away with horns to reach grasses, while giant ground sloths lumbered slowly through South America, feeding on leaves high above the ground. These were the giants of the Pleistocene, sculpted by ice and open land, by scarcity and endurance. Predators rose to match them. Saber-toothed cats perfected the ambush, their long canines designed for precision strikes on prey much larger than themselves. In North and South America, Smilodon ruled as one of the most formidable hunters ever to live. Lions, larger than today's, prowled across continents, while dire wolves hunted in packs with strength in numbers. Hyenas too flourished, their jaws powerful enough to crush bone, leaving behind fossilized middens of shattered remains. Birds of prey circled icy skies, while in South America terror birds made their final stand, their reign nearing its end as mammals grew too fast and too fierce to be contained. But the Pleistocene was not merely a theatre of beasts. It was the epoch of beginnings for humanity. The lineage of hominins that had first stood upright in the Pliocene now expanded and diversified. Early humans, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and later Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis, spread across Africa, Asia, and Europe, carrying with them fire, tools, and the ability to hunt cooperatively. Their stone implements chipped from flint and obsidian reveal minds capable of foresight and hands capable of precision. They were small compared to mammoths and fragile compared to lions, but they carried a strength no other creature possessed, the power to adapt not only their bodies but their environments. The Pleistocene landscapes reflected this duality of ice and warmth. During glacial maximum, tundras stretched where forests had once been, dominated by hardy grasses, sedges, and mosses. Herds of grazers, horses, bison, reindeer, thrived in these mammoth steppes, feeding predators and sustaining human hunters alike. During interglacials, forests returned, filled with deer, boar, and smaller mammals. Rivers swelled with fish, and wetlands became havens for birds. The earth shifted back and forth, a pendulum of climates that forced every species to become nomadic in some sense, following food and water across changing terrains. In Africa, where ice sheets did not reach, the Pleistocene saw the persistence of savannas filled with antelopes, elephants, and lions. It was here that Homo sapiens eventually emerged, shaped by cycles of drought and abundance. Their survival depended on cooperation, communication, and innovation. Fossils and archaeological sites reveal early humans crafting spears, controlling fire, and painting images of animals on cave walls. These were not merely acts of survival, but of imagination, glimpses of a species beginning to see itself as apart from, yet deeply entangled with, the rest of nature. The oceans, too, pulsed with change. As glaciers locked away water, sea levels fell, exposing land bridges that connected continents. Humans and animals alike migrated across these ephemeral corridors, from Asia to North America via Beringia, from Eurasia into Britain across dry seafloors, and between islands where shallow seas retreated. Marine ecosystems adjusted as coastlines advanced and retreated, reshaping estuaries and reefs. Whales, seals, and walruses adapted to icy waters, while penguins and seabirds thrived along frigid coasts. Sharks and fish continued their eternal cycles, but the marine world was no longer only shaped by currents and climate. It was also touched by human hunters, whose harpoons and cooperative strategies began to challenge even the mightier sea creatures. Plants carried on their quiet role as the foundation of life, reshaping themselves to endure ice and thaw. Grasses dominated vast steppes, their resilience unmatched. Conifers and deciduous trees shifted their ranges north and south with every glacial pulse, their pollen preserved in sediments as time capsules of change. Some ecosystems collapsed under the weight of cold, only to regrow in interglacials, proving that even in fragility there was persistence. Fire became a critical ecological factor, set by both lightning and humans, reshaping forests and grasslands alike. The fossil record of the Pleistocene is both grand and intimate. Skeletons of mammoths frozen in Siberian permafrost preserve hair and flesh, their last meals still in their stomachs. Caves in Europe hold bones of cave bears, their remains mingled with those of Neanderthals who once painted walls with ochre and charcoal. Tar pits in Los Angeles capture the struggles of saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and mammoths trapped in sticky death. These fossils are not distant abstractions, but vivid reminders of a world that ended only yesterday in geological terms, a world where humanity and megafauna shared the same winds and fires. And yet, the Pleistocene was fragile. Its megafauna, adapted to cycles of cold and abundance, were vulnerable to change too rapid or too profound. As climates warmed near the end of the epoch, ice retreated, seas rose, and forests spread once more. human hunters, more skilled and widespread than ever, added pressure. One by one, giants began to vanish. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. Whether by climate, by humans, or by both together, the great beasts of the Pleistocene disappeared, leaving behind only bones and legends. The Pleistocene was an age of grandeur, but also of transition. It saw the rise of ice sheets and the fall of giants, the spread of humans and the extinction of the beasts they once hunted. It was the crucible in which modern ecosystems were forged and the stage upon which humanity stepped fully into its role as a planetary force. Yet even as glaciers retreated and seas swallowed coastlines, the story was not finished. The Holocene lay ahead, a time when the ice would pull back, climates would stabilise, and humans would begin to write their own chapter in the long recovery from the Chicxulub impact. And as the Pleistocene closed, the Earth, scarred yet fertile, seemed to ask a question. What would happen when one species, fragile in body but powerful in mind, began to shape not only its own survival, but the destiny of the planet itself? The Holocene emerged quietly, around 11,500 years ago, as the last great sheets of ice withdrew from the continents. Compared to the violent Chicxulub impact, compared to the fiery upheavals of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, this transition was subtle, gradual, almost merciful. Yet its consequences were profound, for it created the world most familiar to us today, the stable climates, the predictable seasons, and the ecosystems in which humanity would rise to its extraordinary role. The Holocene was not merely another chapter in Earth's story of recovery. It was the moment when life's resilience reached a new threshold, when one species began to reshape the entire biosphere in ways no asteroid or glacier ever had. As the glaciers retreated, they left behind vast scars upon the land. Valleys carved by rivers swollen with meltwater, fertile plains enriched by glacial deposits, and lakes formed in depressions where ice had once lain heavy. Forests spread into these new spaces, carpeting Europe, Asia, and North America in green. Grasslands expanded where the ice had thinned soils, creating open prairies and steppes that supported herds of bison, deer, and antelope. In Africa, savannas stabilized, sustaining elephants, giraffes, and lions much as they still do today. The planet, freed from the crushing weight of ice, seemed to breathe more freely, its ecosystems redistributing themselves with confidence. The animals of the Holocene were both survivors and inheritors. Many of the great Pleistocene giants had disappeared: mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, leaving behind emptiness in the ecological web. Into these absences stepped smaller, more adaptable species. Deer, elk, and antelope multiplied across forests and plains. Wolves, coyotes, and big cats honed their strategies to pursue them. Birds diversified into niches left vacant by vanished predators. The ecosystems of the Holocene were leaner than those of the Pleistocene, less crowded with colossal forms, but no less vibrant. They were ecosystems shaped for speed, resilience, and adaptability. The oceans, too, stabilized in their modern forms. Rising seas from melting glaciers flooded coastlines, creating the familiar outlines of continents. Coral reefs flourished in warm waters, becoming vibrant cradles of marine diversity. Fish populations surged in abundance, feeding seabirds, seals, and whales. The great baleen whales, already immense, adapted to shifting currents, travelling thousands of miles to exploit seasonal plankton blooms. Toothed whales perfected their hunting techniques, echoing through the oceans with songs and clicks. Marine ecosystems settled into rhythms that would last until the modern disruptions of human industry and climate change. Plants mirrored the steadiness of this epoch. Forests spread across temperate zones, while tropical rainforests flourished with extraordinary diversity. Grasses, however, became the quiet architects of entire continents. Their resilience under grazing and fire sustained vast grasslands in Africa, North America, and Eurasia. These grasslands became the theatres of some of the Holocene's most iconic dramas. The migrations of wildebeest across the Serengeti, the thundering herds of bison across the Great Plains, the stealth of lions and wolves hunting in their wake, the intimate partnership between grasses, grazers and predators defined much of the Holocene's ecological character. And within this balance, humanity stepped fully into its place. From its African cradle, Homo sapiens spread across continents carrying tools, fire and language. At first, humans were hunters among hunters, scavengers among scavengers, chasing herds across plains, fishing in rivers, and foraging in forests. But slowly they began to do something no other species had ever done. They altered landscapes deliberately. The domestication of plants and animals, first wheat and barley, then rice, maize, cattle, goats and sheep, marked a profound shift. Agriculture transformed valleys into fields, rivers into irrigation channels, and wild animals into companions and tools. Humanity no longer adapted merely to ecosystems, it began to remake them in its own image. The consequences of this transformation rippled outward. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and civilizations rose on the backs of rivers, fertile soils and tamed herds. Forests were cleared, grasslands ploughed, wetlands drained. The Holocene became an epoch not just of natural recovery but of cultural invention. Humans painted caves in the Pleistocene, but in the Holocene they built temples, pyramids and cities. They invented writing, carved symbols of their gods and ancestors, and mapped the stars. The resilience that had carried life through catastrophe now expressed itself in stories, rituals and technologies, echoing across generations. And yet, the Holocene was not free of climate's hand. Periodic shifts, such as the Younger Dryas, a brief return to near-glacial cold, reminded humanity of the fragility of stability. Droughts tested early civilizations, toppling some while strengthening others. Floods reshaped coasts and valleys. Volcanic eruptions cast ash into skies, dimming the sun for years. The earth, as always, was restless, but humans responded with invention, building granaries to withstand famine, canals to tame rivers, and myths to make sense of uncertainty. Their adaptability mirrored that of the grasses and wolves. Their ingenuity mirrored that of primates who had long ago grasped fruits in forest canopies. The Holocene also saw the final reshaping of animal communities. Domesticated dogs became hunting partners, sheep and goats became sources of food and clothing, and horses became engines of mobility and power. Wild species adapted to coexistence with humans or vanished in the face of pressure. Some, like the aurochs, were driven to extinction even as their domesticated descendants, the modern cow, spread across the world. The Holocene was not only a time of recovery but a time of replacement, when the natural order of ecosystems gave way to one increasingly managed by human hands. In this sense, the Holocene represents the culmination of Earth's long recovery from Chicxulub, from the silence of extinction, through the fever of the PETM, the cooling of the Oligocene, and the ice ages of the Pleistocene. Life had persisted, diversified, and transformed. Each epoch added its own experiments: primates in the trees, whales in the seas, grasses on the plains. But in the Holocene, one lineage transcended survival to take control. Humanity became not only a participant in ecosystems, but a shaper of them, bending rivers, domesticating plants, and altering landscapes at scales once reserved for tectonic forces. And yet, this triumph carries its own ambiguity. The stability of the Holocene, the climate that nurtured agriculture and civilization, is fragile. Already, through industry and expansion, humanity has begun to shift the balance, releasing carbon and altering ecosystems in ways that recall past upheavals. Some scientists argue that the Holocene has ended, replaced by a new epoch, the Anthropocene, an age defined not by asteroids or glaciers, but by the actions of one species. If true, then humanity has become both the survivor and the catastrophe, both the inheritor of recovery and the author of disruption. Still, the Holocene remains a testament to life's resilience. It shows how, after fire and ice, after loss and transformation, Earth can stabilize, ecosystems can flourish, and new possibilities can emerge. It is the chapter in which the recovery from Chicxulub is complete, when life not only endured but reinvented itself into forms unimagined by the dinosaurs who once reigned. And it is the chapter where humans stepped onto the stage, fragile in flesh but vast in imagination, ready to write a future both uncertain and profound. As the Holocene stretches into the present, the Earth whispers the same question it has asked since the day of the impact. What will survive? What will vanish? And what new forms of life will arise from the choices made in this age of balance? For recovery is never truly finished. It is the heartbeat of Earth itself, a rhythm that echoes from asteroid to ice to fire, reminding us that the story is not over, and perhaps never will be.